My dad looked me right in the eye and told me we could not afford even an economy ticket for our family holiday trip. I smiled, looked at my brother, who was already flying business class on my parents' dime, and said, "Do not worry, Dad. I will find my own way." Hours later, I watched my brother post photos from the private lounge, captioning it, that Christmas is better without dead weight. He even texted me telling me not to beg. When I showed up at the airport the next day, the lead pilot walked right past my stranded family and told me my private jet was ready for boarding. They eventually returned home only to find a completely empty house because I took everything that was legally mine. Before I dive into this story, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach your family a lesson about your true worth. My name is Chelsea. I am 33 years old, and my family pushed me exactly one step too far. The air inside the formal dining room of my parents' suburban Chicago home felt exceptionally thick, heavy, with the kind of tension I had spent my entire life learning to navigate. We were gathered for our annual pre-Christmas dinner, a tradition that was theoretically supposed to be about gratitude and family bonding. Instead, it had always been a carefully choreographed performance, where my father Richard played the benevolent patriarch, and my mother Susan acted as the proud matriarch presiding over her perfect, flawless realm. The long dining table was set with the fine china, the heavy silver cutlery, and crystal wine glasses that perfectly caught and reflected the soft, warm glow of the overhead chandelier. The rich aroma of roasted tenderloin and fresh rosemary filled the room, masking the underlying emotional rot that plagued our family dynamic. But the real main course of the evening was always the impending reveal of our holiday plans. Every single year, Richard planned an extravagant winter getaway. He absolutely lived for the moment of handing out the travel itineraries. It was his ultimate power trip, his way of reminding us who held the purse strings and who controlled the family narrative. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, trying my hardest to maintain a pleasant, neutral expression while bracing myself for the usual passive-aggressive remarks. Growing up in this environment meant learning to shrink myself. I was the one who was expected to be grateful, to be quiet, and to accept whatever scraps of attention or affection they deemed me worthy of receiving. My parents valued outward success and loud bragging qualities I never possessed. I was always the quiet observer, the one who worked behind the scenes, the one whose achievements were routinely dismissed or completely ignored. Richard loudly cleared his throat, tapping a stack of thick, glossy envelopes against the polished wood of the table. He stood up slowly, making absolutely sure he had everyone's undivided attention before he spoke. "This year, we are doing something truly spectacular," he announced, his chest visibly puffing out with pride and self-importance. He walked deliberately around the table and handed the first heavy cream envelope to my mother. Susan beamed, reaching up to touch his arm affectionately, playing her role to perfection. Then he moved to my brother Cameron. Cameron is 35 years old and the undisputed golden child of our family. He has never faced a single consequence he could not charm his way out of, or a financial disaster my parents would not happily pay to fix. Richard handed a gleaming gold-embossed envelope to Cameron, and then handed another identical envelope to Cameron's wife, Brittany. The three of them exchanged knowing, triumphant looks, sharing a silent joke that I was clearly not a part of. I sat there with my hand resting near my empty plate, genuinely expecting him to walk down to my end of the table. I watched the gold lettering on Cameron's envelope catch the light. It read Aspen Luxury Ski Resort. It was the exact same resort we had all talked about visiting for the past 3 years. I waited for my envelope. I kept my hand hovering just slightly above the table, ready to receive my itinerary, ready to be included in the family tradition. I watched as Richard simply turned on his heel and walked right back to his seat at the head of the table. He sat down smoothly, picked up his crystal wine glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his expensive red wine. He did not look at me. The silence in the room stretched out long, agonizing, and intensely uncomfortable. Finally, I lowered my hand to my lap, feeling a hot flush of humiliation creeping up my neck. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even despite the pounding of my heart. "Did you forget to print my copy?" Richard sighed, producing the heavy, burdened sigh of a man forced to deal with an utterly unreasonable child. He set his wineglass down on the coaster and finally met my eyes, his expression devoid of any warmth or parental affection. "We could not swing an economy ticket for you this year, Chelsea," he said flatly, his tone completely devoid of apology. "Times are tight right now, and Aspen is incredibly expensive. You understand." The room went dead silent. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the absolute absurdity of his statement. Times were tight. The man was currently serving a dry-aged beef tenderloin on imported European china. He had just handed out all-inclusive luxury resort packages to 3 adults. Yet he was sitting there looking his own daughter right in the eye, telling her that he could not afford a basic coach fare for a family Christmas trip. "You understand," he had said. It was delivered as a command rather than a question. He expected me to nod dutifully and accept my exclusion, just as I had accepted a lifetime of being treated as a secondary citizen in my own family. My parents had always favored Cameron, but this blatant exclusion felt like a new low even for them. It was a calculated, deliberate message. You are not a priority. You do not matter enough to be included. I looked at Susan, hoping my mother might intervene or offer some explanation, but she just continued eating her salad, avoiding my gaze entirely. She was completely complicit in this cruel little theater production. Before I could formulate a response, Cameron leaned back in his tufted dining chair and let out a loud, booming laugh. "Do not feel too bad," Chels Cameron said, his voice absolutely dripping with condescension and arrogant pity. "First class was completely booked up anyway. Dad had to pull some major strings and pay a ridiculous premium just to get Brittany and me our upgraded seats." The lie was so blatant, so unbelievably audacious, that it literally took my breath away. They had not run out of money. They had actively, consciously chosen to spend thousands of extra dollars upgrading Cameron and Brittany to first class, while simultaneously claiming they could not afford the absolute cheapest available seat for me. Brittany chimed in, holding up her hand to admire her freshly manicured nails in the chandelier light. "The first-class lounge in Aspen is just divine," she murmured, offering a fake sympathetic pout. "It would be a total shame to miss it. But honestly, the resort is so exclusive you would probably feel out of place anyway. You are more of a stay-at-home and read a book kind of girl." I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked directly at Cameron. He was grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. He reached casually into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out his expensive smartphone, and tapped the bright screen a few times. He then slid the phone across the smooth mahogany table until it bumped gently against my water glass. "Read it," he mouthed silently, making sure our parents were distracted by Susan pouring another round of wine. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was a text message drafted and sent directly to my phone number. The notification chimed softly in my purse a second later. I read the words displayed on his screen. It read, "Christmas is better without you anyway. Do not beg to come." I stared at the cruel message, feeling a sudden profound shift deep within my soul. The hurt evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. This was the defining moment. The final thread binding me to their toxic abuse snapped completely. I was done. I gently pushed Cameron's smartphone back across the polished mahogany, ensuring it came to a halt right next to his plate. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not throw my napkin down or storm away from the table. Instead, I calmly picked up my crystal wine glass, holding it by the delicate stem, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. The wine was dry and bitter, perfectly matching the atmosphere in the room. I let the silence stretch, letting them marinate in the sheer cruelty of what had just transpired. I knew they were waiting for a reaction. They wanted tears. They wanted a pathetic display of begging. They wanted me to act like the desperate, excluded outcast they had always painted me to be. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Susan, noticing my eerie calm, immediately jumped in to fill the silence. She could not stand a moment where the family narrative was not being actively controlled. She reached for the wine bottle and leaned over the table, pouring a heavy, generous splash of the expensive red into Cameron's glass, completely ignoring my nearly empty one. "Do not look at your brother like that, Chelsea," my mother sneered, her voice dripping with that familiar practiced condescension. She set the bottle down with a sharp clink. "Your father made a difficult financial decision, but it is the right one. If you did not waste your life running that little travel blog of yours, you could afford your own tickets by now." I set my glass down and offered her a serene, unbothered smile. My little travel blog, that was what they called it. 5 years ago, when I was living in a freezing studio apartment with barely enough money to keep the heat on, I did start a travel blog. But I was not just writing about destinations. I was a software engineer building a complex back-end algorithm designed to track and optimize empty leg flights for private aviation charters. That little blog had pivoted within its first year. It became Aerologics. I spent countless sleepless nights coding the platform, pitching to private jet fleets, and building a luxury travel network from scratch. 3 months ago, Aerologics went public. I stood on the balcony of the stock exchange and rang the bell as my company debuted with a valuation of $1.5 billion. I was the majority shareholder. I was a billionaire. But because I used my middle name professionally to avoid the toxic shadow of my family, and because they never once bothered to ask about my life or do a simple internet search, they were completely oblivious. "Your brother is a senior vice president now," Susan continued, gesturing proudly toward Cameron, who sat up a little straighter, practically preening under her praise. "He carries this family's reputation on his shoulders. He works grueling hours managing real accounts and real money. He needs the rest. Aspen is exactly the kind of environment a man of his stature belongs in. He has earned a luxury vacation." I looked at Cameron, the so-called titan of industry. He was a senior vice president in name, only an inflated title Richard had created for him at the family manufacturing plant, to mask his sheer incompetence. Cameron spent 4 days a week playing golf, taking 3-hour martini lunches, and actively running our father's legacy into the ground. He had nearly bankrupted them twice with terrible crypto investments and gambling debts, but my parents always bailed him out. They threw good money after bad, desperate to maintain the illusion that their golden boy was a roaring success. "It really is a shame you cannot join us." "Chelsea?" Brittany chimed in, her tone laced with fake sympathy as she rested her manicured hand over Cameron's. "But honestly, maybe this will be the motivation you finally need to get a real corporate job. I mean, playing around on the internet and posting pictures of airplanes is cute for a girl in her 20s, but you are 33. It is time to grow up and face reality. The real world does not hand out free first-class tickets to people who refuse to work for a living." I kept my smile firmly in place, leaning back slightly in my chair. "You are absolutely right, Brittany," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of the anger they were trying to provoke. "The real world requires hard work." Richard nodded vigorously, completely missing the irony of my statement. "Exactly," he said, pointing his silver fork at me. "We have funded your brother because his returns are tangible. We paid for his business degree, we helped with his and Brittany's down payment on their house, and we cover these trips because he is the future of this family. We cannot keep subsidizing your hobbies, Chelsea. We refuse to fund your little backpacking trips or your internet projects because we love you enough to teach you independence. You have to learn the value of a dollar. This economy ticket lesson is for your own good. It builds character." The sheer audacity of his lecture was almost physically staggering. Richard was sitting there lecturing a self-made billionaire about the value of a dollar, completely unaware that his own financial house of cards had already collapsed. 3 years ago, when Cameron's hidden debts nearly caused the bank to foreclose on this exact house, my parents had faced total ruin. Rather than let them end up on the street, I had instructed my wealth management team to create a blind LLC I bought the family home directly from the bank, paying off the liens in full. I then allowed them to stay, charging them a nominal rent under the guise of a generous private landlord they never met. They were currently sitting in my dining room, eating off my table under a roof that I legally owned, telling me that I was a financial burden. Cameron scooped a large portion of the mashed potatoes onto his plate, chuckling softly. Dad is right, Chels. You cannot expect handouts forever. I mean, look at me. I grind every single day at the office. I am stressed out of my mind closing deals. Brittany and I need this Aspen trip just to decompress from the massive responsibilities I handle. If you want to ski in Aspen, you need to earn Aspen money. Until then, maybe you can find a nice public sledding hill here in Chicago. I watched him take a bite of his food, chewing with deep satisfaction. He truly believed his own lies. He believed he was a successful businessman, just as my parents truly believed they were practicing tough love by cutting me out of a family holiday. The dynamic was laid bare, illuminated under the crystal chandelier for exactly what it was. Cameron's entitlement was a bottomless pit that my parents happily filled with their dwindling resources, while my independence, my quiet struggle, and my monumental success were mocked as an embarrassing failure. They needed me to be a failure so they could justify showering Cameron with everything they had. I picked up my napkin and gently dabbed the corners of my mouth. The bitter taste of the wine had faded, leaving behind nothing but absolute clarity. They had spent my entire life taking my quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken my refusal to brag for a lack of accomplishment. They had weaponized my career, turning my passion into a punchline for their dinner table jokes. And now they had crossed the final boundary. They had actively chosen to humiliate me, to exclude me, and to revel in my supposed poverty while flaunting the wealth that I was secretly protecting for them. You know, Mom, Dad, I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft, forcing them to lean in just a fraction to hear me. I really appreciate this conversation. I think this is exactly the lesson I needed this holiday season. Susan smiled triumphantly, looking at Richard with a smug expression of total victory. Well, she said, taking a delicate sip of her wine, admitting you have a problem is the first step, Chelsea. We only say these things because we care. We want you to be as successful and established as your brother. I nodded slowly, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of my father, my mother, my brother, and my sister-in-law. They sat there, a united front of arrogance and delusion, utterly convinced of their superiority. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was completely hollow. They had no idea that the daughter they were currently mocking held the deed to their home, the leverage to their debts, and the power to dismantle their entire fabricated reality with a single phone call. I am sure Cameron's success will keep you all very warm this winter, I replied. My smile widened just a fraction, no longer polite, but sharp and dangerous. I looked directly at my father, memorizing the look of condescending pity on his face, knowing it would be the very last time I would ever let him look at me that way. I held my father's gaze for a long, unbroken moment. The silence in the dining room became absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. The expensive grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds, each rhythmic sound amplifying the intense, suffocating tension. Richard expected me to look away. He fully expected the familiar crumpling of my shoulders, the wavering of my voice, the quiet, defeated acceptance of my designated role as the family disappointment. He wanted me to lower my head and apologize for not being good enough. Cameron shifted his weight in his chair, his obnoxious smirk widening as he waited for the inevitable tears. Brittany was practically vibrating with anticipation next to him, her fingers twitching near her phone, already mentally composing the text message she would send to her friends about my pathetic, predictable breakdown. They were a captive audience eagerly awaiting a tragedy, but the tears never came. The crushing weight of seeking their approval, a heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for 33 years, simply vanished. It evaporated into the stale air of the dining room. It was replaced by a profound, icy calm that settled deep into my bones. I pushed my chair back from the table. The heavy wooden legs scraped against the imported Persian rug, the sound unnaturally loud and abrasive in the quiet room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress with completely steady hands. I did not look at Cameron. I did not acknowledge the vicious text message still glowing brightly on his phone screen. I turned my attention entirely to the hallway where I had left my belongings. I walked with deliberate, measured steps to the front coat closet and retrieved my winter coat. It was a custom-tailored cashmere piece I had picked up in Milan last month after closing a massive European charter contract. To my parents, it was probably just another sign of my irresponsible spending habits, a frivolous purchase by a girl who refused to get a real job. I slipped it on, feeling the familiar comforting weight of the luxurious fabric settle over my shoulders like a perfectly fitted suit of armor. I walked back to the grand archway of the dining room. They were all still sitting there staring at me. Their collective portrait of smug satisfaction was slowly morphing into slight, uncomfortable confusion at my complete lack of a dramatic meltdown. I looked directly at my father. He had his crystal wine glass raised halfway to his mouth, pausing his movements to see what kind of pathetic plea I would offer. "Do not worry, Dad," I said. My voice was incredibly clear, ringing through the dining room without a single tremor of emotion. "I will find my own way." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Richard lowered his glass slowly, his thick eyebrows drawing together in a deep frown of annoyance. He did not like this script. This was not the reaction he had orchestrated. He wanted a begging daughter, not an indifferent one. Before he could formulate a harsh response to put me back in my place, Susan jumped in. She was desperate to reclaim control of the narrative, terrified that I was walking away with my dignity intact. She slammed her linen napkin onto the polished table, her face flushing with sudden irrational anger at my unbothered composure. "Oh, please, Chelsea, do not play the martyr!" Susan snapped, her voice shrill and grating against the quiet elegance of the room. "We all know exactly how this ends. You are going to storm out of here, go back to your cramped little apartment, and realize you absolutely cannot afford a holiday trip on your own. But let me make one thing perfectly clear right now. When you end up stranded at the Greyhound station holding a cheap bus ticket because you cannot manage your basic finances, do not call your father crying for a bailout. We are not wiring you a single cent. Cameron needs all of our focus right now. He has a very stressful quarter coming up at the company, and we will not let your financial irresponsibility ruin his Aspen trip. Are we understood?" I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me to be quieter, to be smaller, to step aside so Cameron could shine. I looked at the woman who was currently lecturing me about financial responsibility while sitting comfortably in a house she did not even know she no longer owned. She was issuing ultimatums from a dining room that belonged to my blind LLC. I had bought this property to save her from the absolute destitution caused by the very son she was currently praising as the family savior. The sheer blinding irony of the moment was almost intoxicating. I did not feel the need to correct her. I did not feel the need to scream the truth. The truth was a weapon I was saving for the perfect moment. I gave her one final polite nod. "Perfectly understood, Susan," I said deliberately, dropping the title of mom entirely. "Have a wonderful trip." I turned on my heel and walked down the long, sweeping hallway. I passed the antique vases and the expensive artwork that my money had quietly protected from bank repossession. I opened the heavy front door and walked out, pulling it shut behind me with a solid, satisfying click. I did not slam it. Slamming the door would imply they had gotten under my skin. I simply closed it on them, firmly shutting the door on 33 years of toxic emotional abuse and relentless manipulation. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago evening. The winter air was brutal, a sharp biting wind sweeping off Lake Michigan and whipping across the manicured lawns of the affluent suburban neighborhood. The cold hit my face instantly, but I welcomed it. It felt clarifying. It felt clean. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my car, leaving the warm, suffocating glow of my parents' house far behind me. The snow was already beginning to fall, dusting the dark pavement with a fine, powdery white layer. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, stark shadows across the quiet street. I unlocked my car and slipped into the driver's seat, the leather freezing against my back. I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. I sat in the darkness listening to the wind howl against the windows. For the first time in my entire life, I was not planning my next move around how my family would react. I was not calculating how to minimize my presence or how to win their elusive approval. The pivot was complete. The era of passive endurance was officially over. From this second forward, I was stepping into active retaliation. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of wealth, access, and power. They wanted to use money to isolate and humiliate me. They had no idea they had just challenged the owner of the board. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin of my car. I bypassed my personal messages, completely ignoring the toxic thread of family group chats and Cameron's lingering digital taunts. Instead, I opened my secure corporate communication channel. I pulled up the private encrypted thread with Marcus, my chief operations officer at Aerologics. Marcus and I had built the aviation platform together from the ground up, navigating complex global logistics, predicting severe weather patterns for private flight corridors, and managing the demanding schedules of billionaires, celebrities, and heads of state. I knew the aviation systems better than anyone, and I knew exactly what was brewing over the Midwest. The incoming weather front was not just a passing winter flurry, it was a massive paralyzing blizzard. I had studied the detailed meteorological reports generated by our flight software earlier that morning. By tomorrow afternoon, the entire commercial aviation grid out of Chicago O'Hare would be completely frozen. Every single commercial flight, including the heavily upgraded first-class seats Richard had so proudly purchased for his golden boy, would be permanently grounded. They were going to be trapped in the absolute chaos of a collapsed transit system surrounded by thousands of angry, stranded passengers. I let out a long, slow breath, watching it plume in the freezing air of the car. My thumbs flew across the digital keyboard with practiced precision. I typed the message that would set the entire trap into motion, sealing their miserable fate. Marcus, I wrote, the Aspen commercial flights are going to be grounded due to the incoming storm tomorrow. Total gridlock is expected by midday. Prep my personal Gulfstream G650. Make sure the de-icing crew is on standby, and file the flight plan for our private high-altitude corridor. I am bypassing the commercial mess entirely. I am flying out at noon. Have the crew stock the cabin and confirm our arrival at the private terminal in Aspen. I hit send. The message delivered instantly. Within seconds, the red receipt appeared on the screen, followed almost immediately by a quick confirming reply from Marcus. Understood, boss. The G650 is prepped and waiting. You are cleared for a noon departure. Safe travels. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I finally turned the key in the ignition, the powerful engine roaring to life and breaking the silence of the winter night. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the house. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the road, watching the snow swirl violently in the bright beams of my headlights. My father thought he was teaching me a brutal lesson about the real world. My mother thought I would end up crying at a dirty bus station. Cameron thought he had successfully humiliated me into permanent submission. They were all about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson about exactly who they had been messing with. The storm hit Chicago with a brutal, unapologetic ferocity just hours after I walked out of my parents' front door. Freezing wind howled off the lake, driving sheets of heavy white snow horizontally across the city and completely burying the interstates under layers of ice. By 10 in the morning, the entire commercial aviation grid was paralyzed. Flights were canceled by the hundreds. Local news channels broadcasted endless footage of stranded holiday travelers sleeping on their luggage, trapped in a rapidly deteriorating logistical nightmare. It was exactly the kind of catastrophic weather event my Aerologics algorithm had predicted the night before. I arrived at the O'Hare private aviation terminal in the back of a chauffeured black SUV, the heavy snow tires effortlessly gripping the packed tarmac. Inside the private VIP lounge, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the blizzard raging outside. It was silent, deeply warm, and scented with subtle cedar. A uniformed concierge greeted me by name, offering a tray of warm towels and fresh espresso. I accepted the espresso with a polite nod, sinking into a plush leather armchair while my flight crew finalized the complex de-icing procedures for my Gulfstream G65. I wore a tailored slate gray cashmere coat over a simple white silk blouse and dark trousers. It was an outfit that screamed understated quiet wealth, completely devoid of the flashy designer logos my family obsessively flaunted. I felt remarkably rested. Cutting the emotional cord to my toxic family had granted me the best, most peaceful night of sleep I had experienced in years. I checked my diamond watch. I had exactly 45 minutes before takeoff. It was just enough time to handle one final piece of personal business before leaving the city and my family far behind me. I left the serene sanctuary of the private lounge and made the long, winding walk over to the main commercial concourse. The transition was incredibly jarring. Pushing through the heavy glass doors into Terminal 3 was like stepping into an active combat zone. The sheer volume of human misery was overwhelming. Thousands of stranded, exhausted passengers were crammed into every available square inch of floor space. Children were crying on piles of coats, people were shouting into their cell phones in sheer panic, and the lines for the customer service desks snaked around the fast food courts like endless defeated rivers. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, damp winter wool, and absolute desperation. I navigated through the sea of frustrated travelers with a focused, steady pace, my cashmere coat brushing past mountains of abandoned luggage. I was looking for a specific retail kiosk near the international departure gates. Behind the counter of a small, brightly lit electronics shop stood Maria. 5 years ago, when I was completely broke and coding my aviation software on a refurbished laptop, Maria managed the coffee shop below my freezing apartment. She used to give me free pastries at closing time and let me sit in her heated shop for hours when I could not afford my own utility bills. She had believed in my relentless grind when my own parents had openly mocked it. I walked up to the counter. Maria looked up, her tired eyes widening with genuine surprise and absolute joy. We shared a warm, tight hug across the display cases, ignoring the chaos around us. I did not stay long, just enough to catch up briefly and slip a thick white envelope directly into her hand. Inside was a handwritten holiday card and a certified cashier's check for $50,000. It was a token of deep gratitude for the kindness she showed a desperate girl who had nothing. Maria opened the envelope, gasped loudly, and started to cry, her hands shaking as she tried to hand it back to me. I simply closed her fingers over the paper, kissed her cheek, told her to have a beautiful Christmas, and turned away. I felt a profound sense of lightness in my chest as I started making my way back through the crowd toward the private aviation wing. I was mentally preparing to board my jet, take off into the winter sky, and sip vintage champagne above the clouds. But the universe has a very funny way of orchestrating perfect timing. As I approached the central security checkpoint, a loud, grating, instantly recognizable voice sliced right through the dull roar of the crowded terminal. The sound of that voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was Cameron. He was standing at a premium airline customer service desk, his face flushed an ugly, blotchy red. He was leaning aggressively over the fiberglass counter, pointing a rigid finger directly into the face of a completely exhausted, terrified gate agent. I paused behind a massive concrete pillar completely concealed from his line of sight and watched the pathetic spectacle unfold. "Do you have any idea how much money I spent on these tickets?" Cameron bellowed, slamming his fist onto the counter so hard the agent flinched. "You are telling me a little snow is keeping my first-class flight on the ground? I am a senior vice president. I have a non-refundable reservation at an exclusive resort in Aspen. Put me on a plane right now." The gate agent, typing frantically on her keyboard, tried to calmly explain that the FAA had grounded all commercial flights due to zero visibility and unsafe runway conditions, but Cameron absolutely refused to listen. He demanded to see a regional manager. He threatened to have the woman fired. He threw a massive public temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler denied a plastic toy. Standing a few feet behind him, looking utterly miserable, were my parents and Brittany. Susan was clutching her oversized designer handbag to her chest, like a shield, her face pale, drawn, and deeply exhausted. Richard was aggressively pacing back and forth, muttering angrily into his cell phone, trying to reach some airline executive he claimed to play golf with. They had clearly been trapped in this miserable terminal all night long. Their expensive winter vacation clothes looked rumpled and slept in. Susan's hair was completely flat. The illusion of their untouchable wealth and superiority was completely shattered by the great equalizer of a commercial airline weather delay. They were just like everyone else, now stranded, tired, angry, and entirely powerless. I stood in the shadows, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. The contrast between my reality and theirs was poetic. I could have kept walking. I could have easily slipped past the concrete pillar, returned to the warmth of my private jet, and left them to wallow in their own self-inflicted misery without ever making my presence known. But I did not. The era of me hiding in the background was over. I stepped out from behind the pillar and walked directly into their line of sight. I moved with a slow, deliberate grace, my heels clicking softly against the terminal floor, slicing through the ambient noise. I stopped about 10 feet away from the customer service desk, simply watching my brother continue to humiliate himself. It did not take long for Cameron to notice me. He spun around, running a frustrated hand through his perfectly styled hair, ready to yell at someone else, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely confused. His exhausted brain could not process why I was standing there looking so incredibly put together, so rested, and so completely unbothered while his entire world was falling apart. Then the confusion instantly morphed into a nasty, vindictive sneer. He desperately needed a target for his mounting helpless rage, and I had just presented myself on a silver platter. "Well, well, well," Cameron announced loudly, his voice echoing across the crowded gate area, intentionally drawing the attention of the miserable passengers waiting in line behind him. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. What are you doing here, Chels? Trying to fly standby?" Richard and Susan snapped their heads in my direction. My mother's eyes immediately swept up and down my body, calculating the cost of my tailored clothes, her lips pursing into a tight line of severe disapproval. Brittany stepped up beside Cameron, crossing her arms over her chest and letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the terminal noise. "Did you come to the airport just to watch the planes take off?" Brittany asked, her tone dripping with toxic venom. "Or did you actually think you could afford a last-minute ticket to crash our family trip?" Cameron stepped toward me, aggressively invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me just like he did when we were kids. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my slate-gray cashmere coat with utter disdain. "You actually put on a nice coat to come beg at the airport," he mocked, his voice loud enough for the terrified gate agent and the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "Listen to me very carefully, little sister. Our first-class flight is delayed by 9 hours, but we are going to Aspen. We are going to sip champagne in the premium lounge while we wait for this storm to pass. You, on the other hand, are standing in the entirely wrong building. The Greyhound bus station is 3 blocks down the street. I am sure you can scrape together enough loose change to catch a ride to some cheap freezing motel for the holidays. Now be a good girl and get out of our sight before you embarrass our family any further." The sheer audacity of Cameron's taunt echoed around us, sharp and grating against the dull, miserable roar of the grounded airport. He was standing in the middle of a commercial concourse, completely trapped by the catastrophic weather, yet he was still desperately trying to play the role of the untouchable billionaire tycoon. I looked at the people waiting in line around us. An older couple was sitting exhausted on their hard plastic suitcases. A mother was pacing, trying to soothe a crying infant. Business travelers were typing furiously on their laptops, their faces illuminated by the blue light of screens showing canceled flight statuses. Everyone was utterly miserable. Yet my family stood in the very center of it all, acting as if they were royalty who had been temporarily and unjustly inconvenienced by the peasants. Richard finally found his voice, stepping up right beside his golden boy to reinforce the family hierarchy. He grabbed the handle of his rolling luggage, his knuckles white with tension. He was absolutely furious that I was standing there presenting a calm, collected image that directly contradicted the pathetic narrative they had constructed for me. "Chelsea, this is entirely inappropriate," Richard scolded, his voice vibrating with a quiet, dangerous anger. He glanced nervously at the surrounding passengers, terrified of the public spectacle. "You are embarrassing yourself. We are dealing with a severe travel disruption. Cameron has incredibly important people to see in Aspen, and this delay is costing him valuable networking time. We do not have the bandwidth to deal with your attention-seeking behavior today." I simply tilted my head, studying him with a blank expression. Networking time. It was a fascinating euphemism for drinking heavily at the ski lodge bar on our parents' dwindling dime. Susan was practically hyperventilating with the desperate need to assert her dominance. She adjusted the heavy collar of her wool coat, pointing a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at my chest. "Do not just stand there staring at us," she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "People are looking. You are loitering like some kind of vagrant hoping for a handout. I told you yesterday we are not funding your life anymore. If you came here thinking you could throw a public tantrum and guilt your father into buying you a ticket, you are gravely mistaken. The Bank of Dad is closed. Now leave before security asks you to move along." Brittany leaned heavily against Cameron's arm, letting out an exaggerated theatrical sigh. "Honestly, it is just sad at this point," she muttered, her tone dripping with toxic venom. "She cannot even take a hint. Cameron, honey, just ignore her. She is just jealous because we are going to a luxury resort, and she has to go back to her sad little life." I opened my mouth, perfectly prepared to deliver the killing blow, but I did not have to say a single word. The universe, combined with impeccable private aviation logistics, delivered it for me. Through the dense, miserable crowd of stranded passengers, a figure emerged. He moved with a crisp, undeniable authority that instantly parted the sea of exhausted travelers. It was Harrison. He was my lead captain, a former military aviator, with 20 years of elite experience, and he looked absolutely immaculate. He wore a sharply tailored dark navy pilot uniform. The gold epaulets on his broad shoulders gleamed brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. His posture was rigid, professional, and entirely out of place in the chaotic, messy commercial concourse. I watched as my family caught sight of him approaching. The transformation in their body language was instantaneous and deeply comical. Richard immediately dropped his aggressive, scolding stance, hastily smoothing his wrinkled jacket and standing up much straighter. Cameron puffed out his chest completely, adjusting his demeanor to project importance. In their deeply narcissistic minds, a man in a captain's uniform striding purposefully toward their specific gate could only mean one thing. They assumed their frantic complaints and threats had finally reached the right airline executive. They truly believed this commanding man was coming to personally apologize to the senior vice president and escort them to a priority storm-defying flight. Cameron actually took a half step forward, a smug, expectant grin spreading across his face. He prepared to receive the absolute deference he felt he was owed by the world. He even raised his hand slightly, ready to greet the captain and loudly accept the apology on behalf of his greatly inconvenienced family. Harrison did not even look at Cameron. He did not spare a single fleeting glance for Richard, Susan, or Brittany. He walked right past my brother's outstretched hand, completely ignoring the men who demanded to be the center of the universe. Harrison stopped directly in front of me. He brought his heels together and delivered a crisp, deeply respectful nod. The absolute deference in his posture was not an act, it was the strict standard protocol for addressing the owner of the aviation fleet. "Ma'am," Harrison said, his voice deep, clear, and commanding enough to carry perfectly over the ambient noise of the crowded terminal. "Your jet is ready for boarding. We've stocked the cabin with the 1996 vintage champagne you requested, and air traffic control just cleared our private corridor to Aspen." The words dropped like heavy lead weights onto the linoleum floor. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet, It was a physical, suffocating vacuum that sucked the air directly out of my family's lungs. I watched the color completely drain from Cameron's face in real time. His smug, arrogant grin vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of slack-jawed, uncomprehending horror. He stared blindly at Harrison, then slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide and panicked. His brain was frantically trying to process the impossible information he had just heard. A personal jet, a cleared private corridor to Aspen, vintage champagne, addressed with total respect to the sister he had just told to go scrape together change for a Greyhound bus. Richard looked as though he had been physically struck across the face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His jaw worked silently up and down. The patriarch, the man who controlled the purse strings, the man who had confidently declared I could not afford an economy ticket just the night before, was paralyzed with absolute shock. He looked at my understated cashmere coat again, finally realizing it was not a desperate attempt to look wealthy, but the casual, everyday armor of someone who actually possessed immense power. Susan was entirely frozen. Her hand was still raised mid-gesture, her perfectly maintained facade shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The mother who had just viciously scolded me for loitering and embarrassing the family was now staring at a private aviation captain, treating her daughter like absolute royalty. She could not breathe. She could not speak. Brittany simply blinked rapidly, her eyes darting nervously between my family and the towering figure of Harrison. The malicious glee was completely wiped from her features, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization of her own profound insignificance. They were waiting for the punchline. They were desperately, wildly hoping this was an elaborate, cruel prank. They waited for me to laugh, to break the tension, to somehow explain away the massive gaping chasm that had just opened up between my reality and theirs. They wanted an explanation. They wanted me to boast. They wanted me to rub it in their faces so they could call me vindictive and cruel, so they could somehow reclaim the moral high ground they had never actually possessed in the first place. I did not give them a single ounce of that satisfaction. I did not gloat. I did not offer a single word of explanation about my company, my billions, or the blind LLC that owned the very roof over their heads. I did not invite them to join me in the warm, luxurious cabin of the G650. I did not offer them a ride. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Harrison. I offered him a warm, appreciative smile, the kind of genuine smile I reserved for people who actually respected me and worked hard for my company. "Thank you," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly calm. "Let's go." I did not turn back. I simply pivoted on my heel and began walking toward the VIP tarmac doors at the end of the concourse. Harrison fell seamlessly into step right beside me, a silent, imposing guard escorting me away from the wreckage of my past. I could feel the burning, desperate weight of my family's stares boring into my back as I walked away. I left them standing exactly where they belonged. I left them trapped in a freezing, chaotic, miserable commercial terminal, completely paralyzed by the crushing realization that the daughter they threw away was the only person in the world who could have saved them. The heavy glass doors of the private aviation terminal slid shut behind me, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the chaotic commercial concourse. The contrast was physically jarring. I traded the smell of anxious sweat and stale airport coffee for the faint, sophisticated scent of cedar and expensive leather. Harrison guided me through the pristine, deserted VIP lounge and out onto the private tarmac. The Chicago blizzard was absolutely raging now. The wind howled across the open concrete, driving thick sheets of snow horizontally through the freezing air. It was the kind of weather that grounded entire airline fleets and brought major cities to a grinding halt. Yet waiting for me through the whiteout conditions was the sleek, imposing silhouette of my Gulfstream G650. The aircraft was fully prepped, its engines already emitting a low, powerful whine that vibrated through the soles of my boots. A specialized ground crew was just finishing the final de-icing protocols, their high-visibility jackets glowing brightly against the dark, stormy sky. I climbed the folding stairs and stepped into the main cabin, leaving the bitter cold of the Midwest and the bitter reality of my family far behind me. The interior of the Gulfstream was a masterclass in understated luxury. Cream-colored leather seats contrasted beautifully with dark polished walnut paneling. The cabin was blissfully perfectly silent, heavily insulated against the roaring jet engines and the howling blizzard outside. My lead flight attendant, Elena, greeted me with a warm, professional smile. She took my heavy cashmere coat, hanging it carefully in the forward closet, before gesturing toward my preferred seat near the wide oval windows. I sank into the plush leather, feeling the tension of the last 24 hours finally begin to drain from my muscles. Before I even had to ask, Elena presented a silver tray holding a crystal flute. Inside, the 1996 vintage champagne I had requested caught the soft cabin lighting, its tiny golden bubbles rising in perfect continuous lines. I took the glass, thanking her softly, and turned my attention to the window as Harrison initiated the takeoff sequence. The jet surged forward with immense, undeniable power. We tore down the cleared runway and launched into the dense, churning snowstorm. Within minutes, the aircraft effortlessly punched through the heavy cloud cover, breaking out into a brilliantly clear, sunlit sky. I took a slow sip of the champagne. It was crisp, complex, and tasted like absolute victory. We reached our cruising altitude of 40,000 feet. Down below, a thick, impenetrable blanket of white clouds completely obscured the Midwestern landscape. I knew that somewhere beneath that massive storm system, my father, my mother, my brother, and my sister-in-law were still trapped in the miserable, suffocating confines of Terminal 3. They were currently fighting for plastic chairs, breathing recycled air, and waiting for a commercial flight that was never going to leave the ground. I, on the other hand, was hurtling toward the Rocky Mountains at near supersonic speeds, wrapped in total silence and absolute comfort. I leaned back, resting my head against the soft headrest, watching the snow-capped peaks of the mountain range slowly come into view on the horizon. The jagged, towering mountains looked magnificent against the bright blue sky. I felt a profound sense of peace. I had not engaged in a screaming match. I had not begged for their understanding. I had simply walked away and let my reality speak for itself. But my quiet contemplation was suddenly shattered. The sharp, distinctive ping of a high-priority security alert echoed through the silent cabin. I set my champagne flute down on the polished walnut table and reached for the secure corporate tablet resting in the side compartment of my seat. This was not a standard email notification or a text from Marcus regarding flight logistics. The alert tone was specifically programmed for my private wealth management team. It meant an urgent financial anomaly had just been flagged on one of my monitored accounts. I unlocked the screen using biometric authentication and opened the encrypted messaging portal. A detailed dossier immediately populated the screen, sent directly from Arthur, the lead portfolio manager, who handled the intricate, highly confidential structure of my personal assets. The subject line was highlighted in stark red text. Unauthorized withdrawal, attempt flagged. I tapped the file, my eyes scanning the dense blocks of financial data and banking codes. As I read the details of the alert, a cold, sharp smile slowly spread across my face. The sheer, magnificent irony of the situation was almost too perfect to believe. Richard Wilson was currently standing at a banking kiosk inside the Chicago airport, frantically attempting to initiate a massive emergency wire transfer. The digital footprint painted a very clear picture of a man in the midst of a total panic spiral. Having just watched his discarded daughter step onto a private jet while his golden boy threw a tantrum over a grounded commercial flight, Richard's fragile ego had clearly shattered. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to prove that he was still the patriarch, the titan of industry, the man who held all the cards. I could easily picture him dialing his private banker, his face purple with rage, demanding immediate action to save face. He was trying to secure a last-minute, highly inflated private charter out of O'Hare to beat me to Aspen. To do that, he needed immediate liquidity. He needed hard cash, and he needed it right that second. The alert on my screen showed the exact amount he was trying to authorize. He was attempting to pull exactly $100,000. But he was not pulling it from a checking account or a liquid stock portfolio, because I knew for a fact those accounts were practically empty. He was trying to draw the funds against the home equity line of credit on the family house in the Chicago suburbs. He was trying to leverage the very roof over his head to buy his way out of an airport terminal. It was a move of staggering financial recklessness driven entirely by spite and wounded pride. He fully expected the transaction to clear instantly, relying on the perceived value of the sprawling suburban estate he had proudly called his kingdom for 3 decades. But the automated banking system had immediately flagged the transaction and blocked the wire transfer dead in its tracks. Richard was undoubtedly currently screaming at a bank representative on the phone, demanding to know why his funds were frozen, completely oblivious to the massive legal brick wall he had just slammed into. The alert on my tablet from Arthur was not just a notification of the blocked transfer. It was a request for instructions on how to handle the unauthorized attempt to encumber my personal property. Richard could not access a single dime of equity from the house because Richard did not own the house. 3 years ago, Cameron's disastrous cryptocurrency investments and hidden gambling debts had brought my parents to the absolute brink of total financial ruin. The bank had issued a final foreclosure notice on the family estate. They were days away from having their possessions thrown onto the front lawn. Rather than allow my parents to experience the public humiliation of a foreclosure, I intervened. I did not write them a check because I knew they would simply hand the money directly to Cameron to squander again. Instead, I instructed Arthur and my legal team to create a blind limited liability company. Through a series of highly insulated proxy firms, my LLC purchased the distressed debt directly from the bank, completely satisfying the liens. The proxy firm then approached Richard with a seemingly miraculous lifeline. They offered to let him remain in the property under a long-term lease agreement with a nominal, easily affordable monthly rent. Richard, blinded by his own arrogance and desperate to maintain his social standing in the affluent neighborhood, signed the extensive legal paperwork without ever reading the fine print. He never bothered to investigate the parent company of the holding firm. He simply assumed his reputation and sharp business acumen had secured him a favorable restructuring deal. He signed away the deed, the title, and every single ounce of equity to a faceless corporate entity. He had been a rent-paying tenant in his own home for exactly 36 months. Every time he boasted about the property value, every time he bragged about his real estate portfolio, he was bragging about an asset that legally belonged to me. The blind LLC that held the deed to the sprawling Chicago estate was a subsidiary of Aerologics. I was his landlord. I stared at the glowing tablet screen, the 1996 vintage champagne warming the back of my throat. My father was trapped in a freezing airport, desperately trying to mortgage a house he did not own to chase down a daughter he had just discarded. The system had locked him out. He had zero equity. He had zero leverage. He had absolutely nothing. I tapped the reply button on Arthur's secure message, my fingers moving with calm, lethal precision. Deny the transfer, I typed, and notify the tenant that any further attempts to encumber this property will result in immediate termination of the lease agreement and an immediate notice of eviction. I locked the tablet, set it aside, and turned my gaze back to the snow-covered peaks of the Rocky Mountains, wondering exactly how long it would take for Richard to realize he was completely and utterly ruined. The transition from the plush, silent cabin of my Gulfstream G650 to my $10 million private chalet in Aspen was utterly seamless. A sleek, matte black helicopter had been waiting on the tarmac the exact moment my jet touched down, its rotors already spinning. It whisked me away over the dense, snow-covered pine forests, bypassing the treacherous, icy mountain roads entirely, and deposited me directly onto the heated, illuminated helipad of my property. The estate was an absolute architectural masterpiece of dark steel sheer glass and massive reclaimed timber, nestled high on a secluded, highly secure ridge overlooking the pristine Roaring Fork Valley. Inside, the soaring floor-to-ceiling windows framed the jagged snow-capped mountain peaks like massive living paintings. A towering stone fireplace dominated the main living area, casting a warm, flickering glow across the imported Italian leather furniture and the thick plush rugs that covered the heated hardwood floors. My private household staff had already anticipated my arrival. They had stocked the massive chef's kitchen, arranged fresh, vibrant alpine flowers throughout the rooms, and prepared a delicate, perfectly executed dinner of seared Wagyu beef and roasted winter root vegetables. I spent my first evening soaking in the steaming water of the outdoor infinity pool, watching the snow fall gently from the dark, starless sky, feeling an absolute untethered sense of freedom and deep, enduring peace. A full 24 hours passed before my family finally managed to drag themselves into the thin, freezing mountain air. While I slept deeply in a massive king-sized bed, wrapped in high-thread Count Egyptian cotton and thick down comforters, Richard, Susan, Cameron, and Brittany had spent the entire night huddled together on the rigid, sticky plastic chairs of Terminal 3. They had breathed stale, recycled airport air, eaten cold, tasteless pretzels from glowing vending machines, and listened to the endless, depressing automated drone of delayed flight announcements. By the time commercial aviation was finally cleared by the FAA to resume limited operations, they were completely broken down. They were exhausted, rumpled, furiously angry, and running on nothing but pure unadulterated spite and caffeine. I knew the exact moment they had arrived at the resort because my cell phone buzzed softly with a social media notification. Cameron, despite operating on zero sleep and wearing the exact same wrinkled clothes he had been sweating in for a day and a half, simply could not resist the desperate, pathetic urge to project his completely fabricated reality to the world. I opened the app and stared at the glowing screen. He had posted a heavily filtered, carefully angled selfie from the grand, bustling lobby of the ultra-exclusive resort they always frequented. He had his arms slung heavily around a visibly exhausted, pale-looking Brittany. Cameron was forcing a massive, artificial, blindingly white grin, holding up a complimentary glass of cheap lobby champagne toward the camera lens. The caption typed below the photo was so rich with irony it almost physically hurt to read. It said, "Living the high life in Aspen. Finally made it. Who needs losers dragging us down?" I chuckled softly to myself, tapping the screen to close the application. The sheer, breathtaking delusion of the man was almost admirable in a dark, twisted way. He was so deeply, fundamentally committed to the illusion of his own absolute superiority that he was willing to completely ignore the humiliating reality of the past 30 hours just to take a petty, meaningless public dig at me. He desperately needed the world to believe he was entirely untouched by the struggles of normal, everyday people. He needed me to see that he had somehow won the day. I tossed the phone onto the plush cushions of the living room sofa and walked slowly over to the massive, gleaming espresso machine in my pristine kitchen. The quiet, comforting hum of the brewing coffee was the only sound echoing in the massive, empty chalet. I took my warm ceramic mug, walked over to the towering wall of windows, and watched a fresh, heavy layer of pristine white snow cover the surrounding pine trees. It was a picture of absolute undisturbed serenity. Then the sharp, demanding, incredibly aggressive ring of my cell phone violently shattered the quiet morning peace. I did not even need to look at the screen to know exactly who was calling me. The timing was just too perfect. The financial trap I had casually set into motion yesterday at 40,000 feet above the Midwest had finally snapped completely shut. I walked back to the sofa, picked up the sleek device, and stared at the bright caller ID Richard Wilson. My finger hovered over the green accept button for a long, deliberate, incredibly satisfying moment. I wanted him to wait. I wanted his rising panic to simmer and boil just a little bit longer. Finally, right before the incoming call rolled over to my voicemail, I swiped the screen and answered. "Hello," I said, my voice projecting a cool, detached, utterly unbothered calm. "Chelsea." Richard practically barked my name through the speaker. His voice was loud, aggressive, and laced with a frantic, breathless panic that he was failing miserably to conceal from me. The background noise coming through the audio feed was incredibly chaotic. I could clearly hear the muted, sophisticated murmur of a luxury hotel lobby, the sharp clinking of brass luggage carts, and the soft, elegant playing of a grand piano. But layered heavily over that expensive ambiance was the unmistakable grating sound of Susan crying hysterically and Cameron arguing loudly and aggressively with someone in the far distance. "What is going on, Richard?" I asked, taking a slow, thoroughly enjoyable sip of my hot espresso, leaning my shoulder against the cold glass of the window pane. "We have a massive, unbelievable problem." Richard snapped, his breathing sounding heavy and dangerously uneven. "I am currently standing at the VIP check-in desk at the resort, and the concierge just declined my black card. Do you have any idea how deeply humiliating this is? They literally cut up the card right in front of my face and handed the plastic pieces back to me. They said the issuing bank flagged the account for massive fraudulent activity and initiated a total immediate freeze on every single financial asset under my name." I kept my facial expression perfectly blank, staring out at the endlessly falling snow. "Oh, that sounds incredibly stressful, Richard. But I am really not sure why you are calling me about this. Have you tried contacting your wealth management team to sort it out?" "I have been on the phone screaming at those absolute idiots for 45 minutes. Richard yelled, his voice cracking with unprecedented, uncontrollable stress. I could clearly hear a hotel employee in the background politely asking him to lower his voice and step away from the desk. Richard completely ignored them. "They are telling me some completely absurd fabricated story. They are saying the freeze was triggered automatically because I attempted to draw $100,000 against the home equity line of credit yesterday afternoon. They are claiming I do not have the proper legal authorization to encumber the property. It is a massive, ridiculous banking error. I own that house. I built that house with my own 2 hands. I have lived there for 30 years. The bank is entirely incompetent, and I am going to sue them into the ground the minute I get back to Chicago." He was completely spiraling. The harsh, undeniable reality of his situation was staring him right in his red, furious face, but his massive, fragile ego absolutely refused to let him see it. He was desperately clinging to the delusion of a temporary banking error because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative that he had foolishly signed away his entire kingdom to a blind LLC and was now completely, utterly broke, was psychologically impossible for his arrogant brain to process. But right now, Richard continued, his tone shifting abruptly from frantic explanation to aggressive, commanding entitlement. "I do not have the time to deal with incompetent bankers. The resort requires an immediate massive deposit for the week, or they are throwing us out into the snow. Cameron has vital dinner reservations tonight with 2 major tech investors from Silicon Valley. His entire holiday, his entire future career trajectory is completely ruined if we get thrown out of this lobby like common criminals." Susan is practically having a nervous breakdown in the VIP lounge area. I remained completely, perfectly silent, letting his desperate, pathetic demands echo in the quiet, luxurious space of my living room. "I saw you at the airport yesterday," Richard said, his voice dropping into a nasty, venomous, accusing sneer. "I saw the private captain. I saw the Gulfstream jet waiting on the tarmac. Do not try to play your stupid games with me, Chelsea. You clearly have some rich, pathetic sugar daddy funding this sudden, lavish lifestyle of yours. I honestly do not care who you are sleeping with or what degrading things you are doing to get access to that kind of money. But you are going to use it right now to fix this. I need you to wire $20,000 to my secondary checking account immediately so I can secure these rooms." The sheer breathtaking audacity of the demand hung heavily in the air. He was completely stripped of his power, publicly humiliated in front of the Aspen elite, and begging his discarded daughter for a financial lifeline. Yet he still felt completely entitled to insult my intelligence, degrade my character, and question my integrity. He could not fathom, not even for a fraction of a second, that a woman could build a multi-billion-dollar software empire entirely on her own merit. In his narrow, deeply misogynistic worldview, my wealth could only possibly be the byproduct of manipulating a wealthy man. "Stop being so incredibly selfish for once in your miserable life," Richard demanded, his voice echoing loudly through the speaker, breathless with rage. Your brother is on the verge of losing a major networking opportunity because of this stupid bank error. Wire the money to me right now, or I swear to God you will never be welcome in our family ever again. I let the absolute absurdity of his ultimatum wash over me. A threat of excommunication from a man who was currently standing in a hotel lobby with a shredded credit card begging for my money. I let out a short, cold laugh that echoed off the massive glass windows of my chalet. You could not afford an economy ticket for me, remember, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly even chill. I have to be careful with my finances. I pressed the red button and ended the call. The silence that rushed back into the room was profound, a stark contrast to the chaotic desperation I had just shut out. I walked over to the sprawling kitchen island and opened my secure laptop. The files were all there, perfectly documented, chronicling the exact reason they were currently stranded without a dime. 3 years ago, Cameron had convinced himself he was a financial visionary. He leveraged millions in unsecured loans to back a highly volatile, highly illegal offshore cryptocurrency scheme. He wanted the fast track to billionaire status without putting in a single hour of actual work. When the market inevitably crashed and the federal regulators started circling, Cameron was left holding a massive toxic debt that threatened to pull him into a criminal courtroom. Richard, blinded by his obsessive devotion to his only son, had secretly liquidated every single viable asset the family possessed to cover Cameron's losses and keep him out of prison. He drained the retirement funds. He emptied the investment portfolios. He ruthlessly drained the equity in the Chicago estate until the bank finally issued a notice of default. They were weeks away from having a county sheriff lock the doors and throw their designer luggage onto the street. That was when I stepped in. I did not do it out of love, and I certainly did not do it out of familial duty. I did it because I required a controlled environment to watch them operate to see if they would ever learn from their spectacular failures. I used a blind LLC entirely untraceable to me to purchase the estate directly from the bank at auction. To maintain the illusion of their precious social standing, my proxy lawyers offered Richard a lease agreement. The rent was a nominal, almost insultingly low figure. It was just enough to cover basic property taxes and keep up the charade that they still owned their kingdom. Richard signed the papers without a second thought, completely convinced his own sheer brilliance and aggressive negotiation tactics had somehow manifested a miraculous corporate bailout. He never knew he was legally bound to me. He never knew he was living in my house. I pulled up the current tenant ledger for the property. The screen displayed a row of glaring red deficits. Richard had not paid the nominal rent in 6 months. I ran a quick forensic trace through my wealth management software to see exactly where his remaining meager income was going. The answer was infuriating yet entirely predictable. Instead of paying the firm that kept a roof over his head, Richard had been funneling every spare dollar into a shell account registered to Cameron. It was seed money for Cameron's newest venture, a vaporware tech startup that possessed no product, no staff, and no actual business plan. It was just an arrogant pitch deck about integrating artificial intelligence into lifestyle branding. Richard was actively defaulting on his legal housing obligations to fund his son's narcissistic delusions. The sheer breathtaking entitlement of it was staggering. He was stealing from his unknown landlord to subsidize Cameron's fake lifestyle, fully believing he was untouchable. I picked up my phone and dialed a dedicated Chicago area code. It was time to stop observing and start dismantling. The era of the blind bailout was officially over. The line rang twice before my lead property manager, Marcus, answered. "Good morning, Chelsea." Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional. "How is the altitude in Aspen?" "It is perfectly clear, Marcus," I replied, pulling up the master lease agreement on my screen. "We need to initiate an immediate breach of contract protocol for the Chicago estate. The tenant is 6 months in arrears. I want the ironclad eviction clause triggered today." "Understood," Marcus said, the sound of rapid typing echoing softly over the line. "I will have the legal team file the emergency notice with the county courthouse within the hour. Standard 30-day notice to vacate." "No," I corrected him smoothly. "Check subsection 4, paragraph B of the lease. The tenant signed a waiver for immediate repossession in the event of gross financial default, and unauthorized asset diversion. They abandoned the property to travel out of state while actively defrauding the holding company. We are executing an immediate lockout. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter flavor. But I was not finished. The LLC had not just purchased the physical structure of the house 3 years ago. To keep the bank from liquidating the interior assets during the initial foreclosure, my company had also purchased the contents of the estate. Richard and Susan had been allowed to keep using the luxury items strictly under the terms of the lease to maintain their facade. Furthermore, Marcus, I want a full repossession team dispatched to the property this afternoon. I ordered my tone, leaving zero room for negotiation. Execute the asset reclamation clause. Every single item purchased or maintained with LLC funds is to be removed from the premises immediately. Just to clarify, ma'am, Marcus asked, verifying the directive with his usual meticulous attention to detail. That includes the vehicles, the electronics, and the designer furnishings. Everything, I confirmed. The 2 Mercedes SUVs in the garage are registered to our corporate fleet. Have them towed and relocated to a secure storage facility. Empty the entire living room. Box up the home theater system, the imported rugs, and the antique dining room set. Strip the master bedroom of the Italian leather furniture Susan constantly flaunts to her socialite friends. I want that house completely hollowed out by sundown. Leave absolutely nothing but the bare walls and the structural fixtures. The logistics will be challenging due to the current blizzard conditions in Chicago, Marcus noted calmly. We will need a massive fleet of moving trucks and specialized crews to navigate the snow. Hire private snowplows to clear their street if you have to, I commanded. Authorize triple overtime pay for the moving crews. I do not care what it costs. I want it done before they can even attempt to untangle their frozen bank accounts and book a standby flight home. Consider it done, Marcus replied, his voice resolute. I will personally oversee the extraction. The property will be secured, locked down, and entirely emptied. I ended the call and set the phone down on the cold granite countertop. The silence in my chalet felt different now. It felt heavy with absolute, irreversible consequence. My family had spent their entire lives evaluating people strictly by their financial utility, discarding anyone who did not serve their immediate need for status. They had treated me as a burden, a failure, an ugly reminder of a life they wanted to pretend did not exist. They had mocked me in the terminal. They had demanded my hard-earned money to save their luxurious vacation while explicitly threatening to cast me out of a family I had financially rescued. Now they were standing in the lobby of an ultra-exclusive resort with a declined credit card, frozen bank accounts, and a canceled reservation. They had absolutely no idea that while Cameron was posting smug, arrogant selfies about living the high life, a team of professional movers was currently backing heavy transport trucks up to their driveway in a Chicago blizzard. They had no idea that the luxury cars they bragged about to their neighbors were being winched onto flatbeds. They had no idea that the carefully curated, deeply expensive interior of their home was being wrapped in industrial plastic and hauled away to a dark, climate-controlled storage unit. When they finally managed to crawl back to the Midwest, exhausted, humiliated, and financially ruined, they would not be returning to a sprawling, comfortable mansion. They would arrive at a completely empty, echoing shell, with a legally binding eviction notice securely taped to the front door. They had told me I was a loser dragging them down. They had ordered me to go find a Greyhound bus. I smiled, looking out at the beautiful snow-covered Aspen peaks. I had just dismantled their entirely fabricated empire with a single phone call, and they were about to learn exactly what it meant to have absolutely nothing. The Aspen Resort Management did not care about Richard's golf handicap, his fabricated corporate titles, or Cameron's vaporware tech startup. When a black card bounces and the backup accounts register as frozen luxury hotels, move with ruthless mechanical efficiency. I received the alert from my security team just as I was finishing my second espresso, the digital trail painting a masterpiece of absolute, unfiltered civilian misery. Resort security had physically escorted my family out of the VIP lounge, They were unceremoniously dumped onto the snowy, freezing cobblestones of the front entrance, dragging their heavy Louis Vuitton luggage behind them. Richard was reportedly shouting empty legal threats at the valet, demanding to speak to the general manager, while Susan sobbed loudly into her ruined cashmere scarf. Cameron, the supposed networking genius, who had just posted a smug selfie mere moments before, stood completely paralyzed. His phone was glued to his hand as he desperately tried to reach any of his fair-weather investor friends to beg for a loan. Naturally, every single one of his calls went straight to voicemail. It was Brittany who finally had to face the humiliating, degrading reality of their situation. The woman who had proudly married into what she believed was an untouchable Midwestern dynasty realized she was the only person standing in the freezing alpine wind with a functional line of credit. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out her personal emergency credit card, a card with a meager limit she kept strictly hidden from Cameron's wandering eyes. Standing on the icy pavement, her fingers turning blue from the cold, she was forced to navigate a discount travel app. There were no first-class seats left. There were no direct flights on legacy premium carriers. The only affordable option that could get 4 people out of the mountains and back to Chicago that same day was a budget airline they had spent their entire privileged lives aggressively mocking. With her jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture, Brittany booked 4 middle seats on a Spirit Airlines flight. The indignity of their journey home was a masterclass in karmic retribution. They were forced to board a crowded, noisy airport shuttle bus, crammed shoulder to shoulder with college students carrying oversized snowboards. Susan complained loudly and incessantly about the smell of the diesel exhaust. Richard kept furiously dialing his bank, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, met only with automated robotic messages regarding total account suspension. When they finally reached the commercial terminal, the reality of budget air travel hit them like a physical blow. There was no private club access. There were no warm, scented towels or complimentary champagne waiting for them. They stood in a massive snaking security line for 2 brutal hours, subjected to the exact same grueling, invasive procedures as everyone else they viewed as entirely beneath them. Once on board the aircraft, the true horror of their situation firmly settled in. The cabin was illuminated by harsh, unforgiving yellow lights. Cameron, a man who regularly bragged about his tailored suits and expansive legroom, was wedged into a rigid, thinly padded, non-reclining middle seat. He was pinned between a crying toddler kicking his shin and a passenger aggressively eating a highly fragrant tuna salad sandwich. He could not even connect to in-flight Wi-Fi to post a distraction on social media because his accounts were completely locked. Susan spent the entire 3-hour flight clutching her designer purse to her chest, her face pale and drawn, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the cabin. She looked absolutely terrified, as if she believed the poverty of her current surroundings might somehow be contagious. The crowning moment of humiliation occurred when Richard, sweating and visibly shaking with stress, demanded a glass of water to take his blood pressure medication. The flight attendant bluntly informed him that all beverages required a card on file. Richard aggressively swiped his platinum card, only to experience the deep burning humiliation of having it declined over a $3 bottle of water. The machine flashed a bright red error message for the entire row to see. Brittany had to lean heavily across the narrow aisle and tap her bright green emergency card against the reader. She did not say a word, but her eyes burned with a furious, unspoken rage directed entirely at her father-in-law. The illusion of the great Richard Wilson was dead, and Brittany was the one paying the funeral costs. They landed at O'Hare International Airport long after midnight. The severe Chicago blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a freezing, gray, heavily salted landscape of towering snowdrifts and biting, relentless wind. The commercial baggage claim was a miserable, exhausting waiting game. Richard severely strained his lower back, pulling their massive, oversized trunks off the grinding metal carousel. There was no chauffeured black SUV waiting at the curb with heated leather seats and tinted windows. They were forced to drag their heavy, rolling luggage through the freezing gray slush to the chaotic, noisy taxi stand. They piled into the back of a battered, aggressively heated yellow minivan cab. The interior smelled distinctly of stale cigarette smoke and damp wool. The ruined suspension rattled violently over every single pothole on the interstate, tossing them against the cheap vinyl seats. Richard sat in the front passenger seat, staring straight ahead into the dark, snowy night. He was muttering under his breath, frantically rehearsing the vicious, aggressive speech he was going to deliver to his wealth manager the exact second the bank opened the next morning. He was absolutely stubbornly convinced that a massive clerical error had temporarily frozen his perfect life. He truly believed that once he walked through the heavy custom oak doors of his multi-million-dollar estate, his reality would instantly realign. He believed the sprawling walls of his mansion would protect him from the humiliating nightmare of the past 48 hours. He believed he was going home. The budget cab pulled up to the curb of the grand suburban estate. The house was completely dark, casting a massive, imposing shadow against the pristine, snow-covered lawn. Richard aggressively shoved a wad of crumpled cash at the driver, not even waiting for his change, and marched up the shoveled walkway. His leather boots crunched loudly in the dead, freezing silence of the neighborhood. Cameron, Susan, and Brittany trailed miserably behind him, shivering uncontrollably and entirely exhausted. Richard reached the heavy, ornate oak front door. He fumbled frantically with his keyring, his hands shaking violently from the biting cold and the sheer overwhelming stress of his bruised ego. He slid the heavy brass key into the lock, turned the thick deadbolt, and pushed the massive door open. He stepped over the threshold and immediately dropped his heavy leather travel bag. It hit the floor with a loud, sharp crack, but the sound did not just land and muffle into an expensive carpet. It echoed. It bounced aggressively off the walls, rolling through the grand foyer and vibrating up the sweeping, curved staircase. It was a hollow, vast, deeply unnatural sound that instantly chilled the blood in their veins. Richard reached out with a trembling hand and flicked the entryway light switch. The massive crystal chandelier blazed to life, flooding the space with bright, unforgiving light, illuminating the absolute devastation. The house was completely, utterly empty. The antique Persian rugs that usually covered the floor were gone, leaving only bare, polished hardwood that amplified every single breath. The massive hand-carved mahogany entryway table was missing. The priceless oil paintings that had lined the grand hallway had been entirely stripped away, leaving only slightly discolored rectangular shadows on the pristine white walls. Susan pushed past Richard, letting out a sharp, terrified gasp. The custom silk drapes had been violently removed from the towering windows, exposing the empty, cavernous, formal living room to the dark, freezing night outside. Every single piece of designer furniture, every imported lamp, every crystal vase, and every high-end electronic device had been meticulously, flawlessly eradicated. Even the grand piano that had sat in the corner for 20 years was gone. Cameron dropped his bags, his mouth hanging open as he stared into the dining room. There was no table, there were no chairs. The grand, sprawling estate they had built their entire identity around the very foundation of their perceived superiority was nothing more than a hollow, echoing shell. They stood shivering in the brightly lit, barren foyer, surrounded by absolutely nothing, finally realizing the true cost of their arrogance. The sharp crack of the leather bag hitting the bare hardwood reverberated through the vast empty space, a sound so hollow and unnatural it seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the freezing foyer. For an agonizingly long moment, nobody moved. The four of them stood completely paralyzed in the bright, unforgiving glare of the crystal chandelier, staring into the gutted remains of their entire identity. The pristine white walls were marked only by faint rectangular shadows, where massive oil paintings and ornate mirrors had hung for decades. The custom silk drapes were gone, leaving the towering floor-to-ceiling windows looking like dark, gaping voids staring out into the Chicago blizzard. Susan was the first to break the silence. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed violently off the bare drywall, rushing frantically into the formal living room, as if hoping the furniture was simply hiding in the shadows. Cameron dropped his own luggage, his hands shaking so violently he could barely pull his cell phone from his designer coat pocket. He fumbled with the screen, his face drained of all color, and dialed 911. "We have been robbed!" Cameron screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic that bordered on a complete meltdown. We need police at the Wilson estate immediately. It is a massive heist. It is a coordinated home invasion. They took everything. My multi-million-dollar tech prototypes, the antiques, the vehicles. Send everyone you have. Richard was pacing the empty entryway like a caged animal, his face a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He was barking manic fragmented theories into the empty air, insisting it was a targeted strike by a syndicate of disgruntled former contractors who were jealous of his immense success. He demanded that Cameron make sure the dispatcher knew exactly who they were dealing with, inflating the estimated value of the stolen goods by the second. Brittany remained frozen by the front door, her arms wrapped tightly around her thin jacket. She looked at the perfectly clean floors, noting the absolute absence of debris or forced entry. She looked at the dust outlines on the walls. She knew with a cold, sinking certainty that this was not a robbery. Criminals in a rush do not unscrew the custom curtain rods and sweep the hardwood before they leave. Within minutes, the wailing shriek of sirens sliced through the howling winter wind. Two police cruisers tore up the driveway, their flashing red and blue lights casting chaotic spinning shadows into the exposed, empty rooms of the estate. Two officers jogged up the shoveled walkway, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts, bracing for a volatile crime scene. Richard threw the heavy oak door open and charged out onto the freezing porch, completely bypassing any standard greeting. He immediately began trying to pull rank on the patrolman. "You need to establish a 3-mile perimeter immediately," Richard barked, pointing an aggressive finger into the driving snow. "Call in your detectives. This is a multi-million-dollar heist. They completely cleaned us out while we were trapped in an aviation nightmare in Aspen. I want roadblocks set up on the interstate. They cannot have gotten far with this volume of high-end merchandise." "Sir, I need you to calm down and step back," the lead officer said firmly, raising a hand to halt Richard's frantic advance. "We need to secure the premises and establish a timeline. When exactly did you leave the property?" Cameron squeezed past his father, waving his phone frantically. "You do not understand the magnitude of this," Cameron yelled, his voice echoing into the street. "My entire tech startup was housed in the West Wing office. The intellectual property alone is worth 8 figures. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for." The officers pulled out their notepads, their expressions shifting from high alert to guarded skepticism as they took in the sheer arrogance of the two men screaming at them. They were just beginning to ask for identification when the deep, powerful hum of a high-performance engine rolled over the sound of the idling police cruisers. A sleek, jet-black SUV glided smoothly up the driveway, its heavy snow tires carving through the fresh powder with effortless precision. The vehicle pulled to a flawless stop, perfectly parallel to the squad cars, the bright headlights washing over the pathetic, shivering group clustered on the porch. The heavy doors unlocked with a sharp, synchronized click. I stepped out into the freezing night air. I wore a tailored floor-length cashmere coat and immaculate leather gloves, projecting an aura of absolute untouchable calm that contrasted violently with their rumpled, exhausted budget airline misery. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, stepped out from the passenger side, carrying a thick leather-bound folio under his arm. The frantic shouting on the porch died instantly. My family froze, their eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock as I walked smoothly past the flashing police lights and stopped at the base of the front steps. Richard recovered first. The shock morphed instantly into a blinding, irrational fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar as he pointed a trembling hand directly at my face. "Arrest her!" Richard screamed at the bewildered police officers, his voice echoing off the brick facade of the house. "Arrest her right now. I know exactly what this is. She is a jealous, vindictive little girl who orchestrated this entire robbery because we went to Aspen without her. She hired a crew to clean out my house out of pure, petty spite while we were trapped in a storm. Put her in handcuffs immediately." Susan pushed her way to the front, pointing a shaking finger at me, tears streaming down her pale, exhausted face. "You monster!" she sobbed loudly. "You destroyed our home just because you could not stand to see us happy." Cameron took a threatening, aggressive step forward, puffing out his chest. "Where is my equipment, Chelsea?" he demanded, trying to sound physically imposing. "Tell the cops where you fenced my electronics right now, or I swear I will press federal charges." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply let my gaze slide over them, taking in their wrinkled clothes, their red noses, and their absolute breathtaking delusion. Marcus stepped smoothly in front of me, placing himself between my advancing family and the police officers. He opened the leather folio and extracted a thick stack of crisply printed notarized documents. He extended his hand toward the lead officer with the effortless, detached calm of a man who charged $1,000 an hour for his time. "Good evening, officers," Marcus said, his voice cutting clearly through the freezing wind and the frantic accusations. "There has been no robbery here tonight. My client is the legal owner of this property and all of its contents. The individuals currently trespassing on the porch are former tenants who have been legally evicted for chronic non-payment of rent and gross breach of contract." The lead officer took the documents, clicking on a heavy tactical flashlight to illuminate the pages. Richard let out a loud, mocking, incredibly aggressive scoff, stepping down to the first stair. "Tenants." Richard barked a nasty, condescending sneer, twisting his face. "Do not listen to this highly paid hack. I bought this house 25 years ago. I built this estate. My name is on the deed. I will have your badge for entertaining this absolute circus." Marcus calmly pulled another document from the folio, holding it up into the beam of the officer's flashlight. "Your name was on the deed until exactly 3 years ago," Richard Marcus stated, his voice ringing with brutal, undeniable authority. "3 years ago, you secretly leveraged the entire equity of this estate to the absolute brink of foreclosure. You did this to pay off a massive, highly illegal offshore cryptocurrency debt incurred by your son Cameron to keep him from facing federal wire fraud charges." Cameron physically recoiled, all the aggressive posturing instantly evaporating from his frame as he stumbled back into the doorframe. Susan whipped her head around to stare at her golden child, her jaw dropping in absolute horror. Brittany closed her eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, the final pathetic pieces of the puzzle falling into place. When the bank inevitably seized the property, Marcus continued unrelenting. "My client's holding company purchased the estate and all of its contents at auction to save you from complete public humiliation. We allowed you to sign a lease agreement and pay a nominal rent to keep up the appearance of ownership." The police officer traced the lines of the master lease agreement with his pen, nodding slowly as he verified the signatures, the LLC names, and the notary stamps. The legal reality was completely airtight. "You have not paid that nominal rent in 6 months," I interjected, my voice slicing through the frozen air like a razor. I stepped past Marcus, forcing Richard to look me directly in the eyes. "You have been funneling your remaining meager cash into Cameron's vaporware startup instead of paying your legal housing obligations. You violated the ironclad terms of the lease. Therefore, my property management team executed a legal lockout. We repossessed every single asset purchased with my company's money. The cars, the designer furniture, the electronics. They do not belong to you. They belong to my holding company." Richard opened his mouth to scream, to deny it, to spin another web of aggressive lies, but no sound came out. The absolute crushing weight of reality had finally broken through his impenetrable ego. He looked at the legal documents in the officer's hands, then looked back at the empty, cavernous hallway of the house he had falsely claimed to own. He was completely stripped of his power, his wealth, and his dignity in front of the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. The lead officer handed the thick stack of documents back to Marcus. He clicked off his flashlight and hooked it back onto his utility belt. He looked at Richard, his expression shifting from concerned alertness to utter, complete dismissal. "Sir, you do not own this house," the officer stated flatly, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet suburban street. "You were legally evicted for 6 months of non-payment. Your belongings were legally repossessed by the property owner." "But where are we supposed to go?" Susan wailed, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated terror. "It is freezing. We have nothing. You cannot just leave us here." The officer shook his head, turning his back on the family. "There has been no crime committed here tonight," the officer said, motioning for his partner to return to the cruiser. "This is a civil matter. The officers walked away, the crunch of their boots on the snow, the only sound cutting through the stunned silence. They climbed into their vehicles, shifted into gear, and drove slowly down the street, the flashing lights disappearing into the dark, snowy night. They left my family stranded on the icy porch of an empty, echoing house they no longer owned, surrounded by their cheap luggage with absolutely nowhere left to go. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the blinding Chicago blizzard, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt physically crushing. The front door remained wide open, allowing the bitter winter wind to whip through the barren entryway, carrying scattered snowflakes that melted instantly against the polished bare hardwood floors. No one moved. The reality of the situation had paralyzed them, trapping them in a nightmare they could no longer deny or delegate away. Then Susan snapped. The delicate, carefully maintained facade of the wealthy matriarch completely disintegrated. She let out a guttural, raw sob, dropping her designer handbag to the floor, and turned her tear-streaked face toward me. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a frantic, desperate malice. She could not process the loss of her material world, so she immediately reverted to the only defense mechanism she knew: weaponized guilt. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Susan screamed, her voice cracking and echoing wildly against the empty walls of the foyer. Her hands shook as she pointed at me, her face contorting into a mask of absolute betrayal. "We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything. And you come into our home, you steal our belongings, and you throw us out into the snow like garbage. You are sick. You are a sick, twisted, vindictive monster." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply unbuttoned my cashmere coat, walked past her trembling form, and headed toward the massive marble kitchen island. It was the only fixture left in the entire sprawling expanse of the main floor, bolted directly to the foundation. My heels clicked with sharp, rhythmic precision against the bare wood. I reached into Marcus's leather folio, pulled out a thick, bound stack of bank statements, and slammed them down flat against the cold marble. The heavy thud cracked through the room like a whip. "You did not raise me," I said, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. "You tolerated my presence until you could legally discard me. And this is not your home. It has not been your home for 36 months. I bought this estate to keep you out of a federal courtroom, and I gave you a lease agreement you willingly signed." Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides, his face a dangerous mottled red. "You tricked us!" he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You hid behind a shell company. You set us up to fail." "I set you up with an incredibly simple set of rules," I corrected him, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the stack of financial documents. "You had one obligation: pay the nominal rent, a fraction of what this property is actually worth. But you could not even manage that. You have not paid me a single dime in 6 months." Susan let out another dramatic sob. "We were struggling," she wailed, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "The market was down. Richard was trying to keep our investments afloat. You are a billionaire. You do not need the money. You just wanted to humiliate us. I did not evict you because I needed the money, Susan." I stated clearly, turning the bank statements around so they faced Richard. "I evicted you because of where the money was going." Richard stared at the top page, his eyes darting frantically over the highlighted lines. His breathing became shallow and ragged. "You told the bank you were restructuring your assets," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly in the empty kitchen. "You told your country club friends you were shifting capital into high-yield tech investments. But these statements tell the actual truth. You took the money you legally owed me for rent, and you used it to buy Cameron's first-class tickets to Aspen." The absolute silence that followed those words was deafening. The only sound was the howling wind outside. Cameron, who had been standing near the doorway, suddenly went completely rigid. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, his eyes darting nervously toward his father. I flipped to the next highlighted page, the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet room. "2 weeks ago, you diverted $5,000 to cover a VIP bottle service tab at a nightclub in Miami, under the guise of an executive networking event. A month before that, you funneled $12,000 into a shell account registered to Cameron for what he called a branding retainer. You have been actively draining my generosity, breaching a legal contract to fund a 30-year-old man's pathetic, narcissistic vanity. Richard did not speak. His eyes remained locked on the financial statements. The numbers were undeniable. The dates aligned perfectly. The money he had desperately scraped together, the funds he had withheld from his supposed landlord to keep his head above water, had not gone to save their home. It had gone directly into Cameron's pocket. Susan stopped crying. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and slowly turned her head to look at her husband. "Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Richard, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not risk our home to pay for Cameron's ski trip." Richard slowly lifted his head. He did not look at Susan. He looked directly at Cameron. The blind, absolute devotion that had defined his relationship with his golden boy for 3 decades was fracturing right in front of my eyes. "Dad, it was seed capital," Cameron stammered, his voice pitching higher as he instinctively backed away from his father's glare. "You knew the parameters of the pitch. I had to secure the right environment to meet with the venture capital guys. You have to spend money to make money. It is basic economics." "Basic economics." Richard repeated, his voice dangerously low. A terrifying, unnatural calm washed over him. "I liquidated my entire retirement portfolio 3 years ago to keep you out of a federal penitentiary when your crypto scheme collapsed. I signed a lease on my own house because I was completely bankrupt. I took every last dollar I had, left the money I needed to keep a roof over your mother's head, and I gave it to you because you swore this new app was going to launch. I was securing investors," Cameron protested loudly, his face flushing red as he pointed an accusing finger at me. "She is just twisting the narrative. I am on the verge of a breakthrough. You cannot let her manipulate you. You spent $12,000 on a branding retainer," Richard shouted, the sudden explosion of his voice making Susan flinch. "You told me you were hiring developers. You told me you needed servers. I needed a public relations consultant to build the brand identity," Cameron yelled back, stepping forward, his massive ego refusing to back down even as his world collapsed. "You do not understand the modern tech landscape. You are a dinosaur playing in a market you do not comprehend. I needed to project success to attract success." Brittany, who had been standing silently by her luggage, finally stepped into the fray. Her face was pale and her eyes were filled with absolute disgust. "Project success?" Brittany laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You spent $4,000 on designer ski wear before we even got on the plane. You made me put our groceries on my personal credit card last month because you said your capital was tied up in escrow. You have been lying to me. You have been lying to your parents. You do not have a company, Cameron. You have an Instagram account." "Shut up," Brittany, Cameron snapped, turning his venom on his wife. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are just a parasite waiting for my payout." Susan let out a horrifying guttural scream and lunged at her son. She slammed her open hands against Cameron's chest, pushing him backward toward the open front door. "You stole our home," she shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I lost my dining room. I lost my jewelry. I lost my social standing. I am homeless because you wanted to drink champagne in Miami. You ruined us. You ruined everything." Cameron shoved his mother away roughly, sending her stumbling into the wall. "Do not touch me," he yelled, his eyes wide and manic. "I am the only one in this family with any actual vision. You are all just holding me back." Richard grabbed Cameron by the lapels of his expensive winter coat, slamming him hard against the doorframe. The impact shook the walls. "I gave you everything," Richard roared, spit flying from his lips as he shook his son violently. "I sacrificed my entire life for you. I protected you, and you bled me dry. You are a fraud. You are nothing but a pathetic, useless fraud." Cameron swung a wild, desperate punch, catching Richard on the side of the jaw. Richard staggered back, clutching his face before lunging forward again, tackling his son to the floor. The two men grappled on the cold, hard wood, shouting obscenities, kicking and swinging wildly at each other in the empty foyer. Susan was screaming hysterically, pulling at Richard's coat, trying to pull him off Cameron while simultaneously hitting Cameron with her purse. Brittany stood by the door, completely motionless, watching the family she had married into physically tear themselves apart. She slowly reached down, picked up her single suitcase, and zipped her coat up to her chin. She did not say a word. She did not try to stop the violence. She simply turned her back on the chaos, walked out the front door, and disappeared into the blowing snow, leaving Cameron behind forever. I stood behind the safety of the heavy marble kitchen island, my arms crossed, watching the absolute destruction unfold. The toxic parasitic dynamic that had sustained them for my entire life was finally eating itself alive. The golden boy was bleeding from his lip. The proud patriarch was rolling on the floor, desperately trying to strangle his only son. The socialite mother was sobbing uncontrollably in an empty room with no furniture and no future. They had demanded my money to save themselves. They had called me a failure. They had insisted I was a lesser human being because I did not possess their refined pedigree. But stripped of their stolen funds and their fabricated status, they were nothing more than desperate, vicious animals fighting over the scraps of an empire that never truly existed. Marcus stepped up beside me, closing his leather folio with a quiet, definitive snap. "We have the perimeter secured, ma'am," he said quietly, ignoring the bloody brawl happening 30 feet away. "The locksmiths are standing by to change the deadbolts as soon as the premises are fully vacated." I picked up my phone and slipped the bank statements back into my bag. "Let them finish their discussion, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm as I buttoned my coat. "Then have security throw whatever is left of them out into the street. Lock the doors behind them." I turned my back on the screaming, thrashing remnants of the Wilson family and walked out the back door toward the waiting SUV. The cold winter air felt incredibly clean, and for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to a long, peaceful flight home. I had my hand resting on the icy chrome door handle of the waiting SUV when the massive oak front door of the estate violently slammed open behind me. The heavy wood struck the exterior brick facade with a sickening, echoing thud that carried down the empty suburban street. I paused, the freezing Chicago wind whipping my hair across my face, and slowly turned around. Cameron came stumbling out into the blinding, relentless snow. He was a complete, tragic physical wreck. The impeccably styled, endlessly arrogant golden boy of the Wilson family was bleeding sluggishly from a split lower lip, the undeniable result of his pathetic, desperate wrestling match with his father just moments before. He wore no winter coat, just a wrinkled, sweat-stained designer button-down shirt that offered absolutely zero protection against the brutal sub-zero Midwestern blizzard. He was shivering so violently that his teeth audibly chattered, his breath puffing into the dark air in thick white clouds, but his eyes burned with a manic, desperate kind of toxic arrogance. He simply could not let me walk away. His fragile, deeply narcissistic ego could not process a scenario where I won and he lost. He needed to drag me down. He needed to prove, even while standing entirely homeless in a freezing snowdrift, that he was the superior, untouchable entity in this family. He stomped down the shoveled concrete walkway, his expensive leather loafers slipping dangerously on a hidden patch of black ice. He threw his arms out wide, attempting to strike a pose of absolute unbothered dominance, though he just looked like a frantic, freezing animal cornered in a dark alley. "You think you're so smart, Chelsea?" Cameron sneered, his voice cracking with a potent mixture of desperation and unfiltered rage, shouting to be heard over the howling winter wind. "You think taking the couches makes you a winner? You think stripping the rugs and stealing our televisions proves that you are somehow better than us? You are completely obsessed with the superficial, with petty, low-class revenge. You do not understand how real power works. You do not understand how actual generational wealth operates. You are just a glorified tenant who got incredibly lucky in the software sector. I am playing a completely different game on a level you cannot even begin to comprehend." I stood perfectly still, leaning slightly against the armored matte black side of my vehicle. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, stood silently beside me, his hands folded neatly in front of him, entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature. I did not say a single word, allowing Cameron to dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. The crushing silence only infuriated him more. He took another step forward, pointing a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face, eager to deliver what he believed was his ultimate devastating trump card. I took out a $500,000 business loan using Dad's manufacturing company as collateral. Cameron announced, his voice ringing with absolute breathtaking, unearned pride. He yelled it as if he had just cured a major disease, as if he had performed a miracle of modern corporate finance. I bypassed all the standard restrictive banking regulations. I went straight to a private commercial lending firm. I secured $500,000 in liquid untraceable capital to fund my new artificial intelligence platform. I used my executive access to leverage the plant. I still have the family business. The words hung in the freezing, violent air like a physical weapon. Behind him, the figures of Richard and Susan emerged onto the dark, icy porch. They looked like terrified ghosts, pale, defeated, and completely hollowed out by the physical and emotional violence of the past hour. Richard leaned heavily against one of the massive stone pillars, clutching his bruised jaw, watching his son with a look of utter, hollow exhaustion. But when Cameron screamed his confession into the night, Richard let out a sound that I could only describe as the noise a man makes when his heart completely stops beating. It was a choked, breathless gasp of pure, unfiltered agony. The manufacturing company was Richard's entire life. It was the legacy business his father had started. The company Richard had spent 40 grueling years building into a highly respected regional powerhouse. It was the only clean, untainted asset the family had left to their name. It was the sole remaining source of their social standing, their identity, and their future income. "You did what," Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently it barely registered over the roaring wind. He staggered forward, his hands grasping blindly at the frozen stone pillar to keep himself from completely collapsing, his eyes wide with a terror that far eclipsed the realization of his residential eviction. "Cameron, tell me you did not touch the company. Tell me you did not forge my signature and leverage the plant." Cameron finally turned around, looking at his broken father with an expression of supreme condescending annoyance. "Relax, Dad," Cameron snapped, waving his freezing hand dismissively, as if swatting away a bothersome insect. "It is a standard bridge loan, a temporary, highly strategic encumbrance. My tech platform is going to generate 10 times that amount in the first quarter of the launch cycle alone. I will pay off the commercial lien before the board of directors even notices the paperwork was filed. I did what I had to do to secure my ultimate future. I saved the family business, and I am going to make it absolutely untouchable." Cameron turned back to face me, his bloody, arrogant smile returning in full force as he completely ignored the whimpering cries of his mother echoing from the porch. "So go ahead, Chelsea. Take the physical house. Take the stupid cars. I honestly do not care. I have $500,000 in seed money and I control the manufacturing firm. I win." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Marcus. Chelsea's lawyer just smiles. It was a slow, incredibly sharp, terrifyingly calm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator watching its completely oblivious prey happily jump directly into the center of a steel trap. Marcus adjusted his expensive glasses and looked at Cameron with a mixture of intense professional amusement and profound clinical pity. I slowly reached my gloved hand into my designer bag. My fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the heavy manila folder I had specifically asked Marcus to prepare and bring with him from our downtown corporate headquarters. I pulled it out into the freezing night air. It was a thick, legally binding packet of absolute financial destruction, stamped with the glaring red seals of a dozen commercial banking regulators and state arbitrators. Cameron watched my hands, his victorious, bloody grin faltering just a fraction of an inch as genuine, creeping uncertainty finally began to bleed into his arrogant, dilated eyes. He noticed the heavy legal seals. He noticed my absolute lack of panic. He noticed that the freezing air around us suddenly felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. I stepped away from the warm security of the SUV and slowly closed the distance between us. The fresh snow crunched loudly beneath my heavy leather boots. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes, forcing him to feel the sheer freezing weight of the reality he had created. I opened my hand. Chelsea pulls a manila folder from her designer bag and drops it at Cameron's feet. It fell through the freezing, violent air and landed with a dull, heavy slap on the snow-dusted pavement, coming to rest exactly against the thin leather of his soaked loafers. "Did you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh, deadly whisper that sliced perfectly through the howling winter storm. Cameron swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. The severe cold was finally seeping deep into his bones, causing his entire frame to shake violently. He stared at the folder on the ground, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mind frantically trying to process the catastrophic implications of my tone. "Because my holding company bought your toxic debt yesterday morning," I delivered the words with absolute surgical precision, watching the remaining color completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a frozen corpse. "You think you possess some innate superior understanding of how global finance operates?" I continued, my voice relentless and entirely devoid of mercy. "You think you can commit blatant corporate fraud, forge your father's signature on a massive commercial lien, and borrow $500,000 from a predatory, unregulated lending firm without anyone doing their routine due diligence. It was a highly distressed, wildly high-risk loan issued by a secondary firm that specializes entirely in trapping desperate, financially illiterate fools exactly like you. The moment you missed your first preliminary interest payment 3 days ago while you were busy drinking cheap champagne in an Aspen lobby and posting arrogant selfies to impress people who do not care about you. That loan went into immediate, irreversible default," I explained, dismantling his entire fabricated reality piece by piece. "When the lending firm ran a secondary automated audit and realized the supposed guarantor of the collateral, Richard Wilson, was currently facing massive personal insolvency and residential eviction, they completely panicked. They immediately packaged your specific debt for emergency liquidation. They needed to offload the bad toxic paper before your father filed for federal bankruptcy protection and shielded the manufacturing plant from corporate seizure." On the porch, Richard let out a low, whimpering, utterly defeated groan and sank heavily to his knees on the cold, snow-covered concrete. He buried his face in his freezing hands, completely broken. He knew exactly what the mechanics of a commercial default meant. He knew his kingdom, his legacy, and his entire life's work was completely, irreversibly gone. Susan collapsed beside him, her screams dissolving into pathetic, breathless hiccups. My financial analysts flagged the distressed asset the exact second it hit the secondary liquidation market, I said, my eyes locked relentlessly on Cameron's terrified face. "I bought the paper for pennies on the dollar while you were crying at the airport security checkpoint in Colorado. And because you explicitly used the company as collateral on a defaulted fraudulent loan, I executed the immediate legal repossession clause attached to the asset." Cameron stared down at the thick stack of legal papers resting against his shoes. He did not move to pick it up. He was entirely paralyzed, his mind frantically, hopelessly trying to reject the catastrophic reality of what was happening to him. He was no longer the golden boy. He was a criminal who had just destroyed his own family. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "You don't own the business anymore, Cameron," I said, the final absolute truth, hanging heavily in the freezing winter air. "I do." Cameron stared at me, his bruised and bleeding lip trembling, as his mind violently rejected the information. He let out a breathless, jagged laugh, shaking his head side to side. He tried to muster that old, familiar sneer, the specific expression of condescension he used whenever he wanted to remind me I was nothing but the family scapegoat. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my chest. "You are bluffing," Cameron spat, though his voice lacked any real conviction, cracking under the freezing wind. "You do not have the liquid capital to buy out a $500,000 commercial lien. You are a mid-level manager at some forgotten firm. You are a nobody. You are just trying to scare us with fake paperwork. Marcus stepped forward, opening his leather folio once again to present the certified banking transfers, but I held up a hand to stop him. I did not need my attorney to deliver this execution. I wanted to look my brother directly in the eyes as I dismantled the entire foundation of his pathetic, unearned pride. I am not a mid-level manager, Cameron, I said, my voice completely level, echoing off the bare walls of the gutted foyer and cutting through the howling Chicago blizzard. For the past 7 years, while you were bleeding our parents dry to fund a luxury lifestyle you never earned, I was building a global logistics network from the ground up. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aerologics. Richard, still kneeling on the frozen porch, let out a sharp, ragged gasp that sounded like a physical tear in his chest. Even Susan stopped her hysterical sobbing, her tear-streaked face turning toward me in absolute paralyzing shock. Aerologics was not a secret in the corporate world. It was a billion-dollar supply chain enterprise that had absolutely dominated the financial news cycles for the past 3 quarters. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The daughter they had mocked, dismissed, and actively driven away was the sole architect of an empire they could only dream of comprehending. My personal net worth surpassed your ridiculous fraudulent loan before my company even went public. I continued watching the manic arrogance drain completely from Cameron's eyes, replaced by a hollow, consuming terror. $500,000 is a rounding error in my quarterly operating budget. Buying your toxic debt was not a financial strain. It was a calculated strategic acquisition. And it gave me a front-row seat to exactly how you destroyed the only real asset this family ever possessed. Cameron stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the doorframe with a heavy thud. He looked wildly around the empty room as if searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere left to run. You ran Dad's manufacturing company into the ground in less than 8 months, I stated, stepping further into the freezing light of the chandelier, refusing to let him look away from me. You did not just leverage the plant to fund your vaporware startup. You committed textbook, undeniable federal loan fraud. Richard forced himself up from the icy concrete of the porch, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. His face was a mask of absolute devastation. What did he do? Richard demanded, his voice a hoarse, broken croak. Chelsea, tell me exactly what he did to my father's company. I kept my eyes locked on Cameron as I answered our father, delivering the forensic reality of his golden boy's business acumen. He could not secure a legitimate commercial loan because the manufacturing company has been operating at a massive net loss since he took over the daily operations. I explained, my tone clinical and completely detached. Traditional banks rejected his applications outright after a single glance at the accounting. So he went to a shadow lender. He went to a high-risk, predatory commercial lending firm. But even shadow lenders require proof of revenue. To secure the $500,000, Cameron fabricated the last 3 years of corporate tax returns. He completely forged the profit and loss statements. He invented phantom client accounts, artificially inflating the company's valuation by over 300%. And then, as the final piece of the puzzle, he forged your signature as the primary guarantor. Susan covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled, horrified wail. Richard looked at his son, his expression shifting rapidly from utter devastation to a blinding, murderous rage. "You forged my name!" Richard roared, lunging forward, but his legs gave out, sending him crashing hard onto the threshold. "You submitted fake federal tax documents using my company. I had to." Cameron screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate whine, his hands flying up to cover his head. I needed the financial runway. The artificial intelligence platform was going to cover everything. It was just a temporary fix to get the seed money. I was going to replace the funds before the first audit. It is not fraud if you pay it back. It is absolutely fraud. Cameron, I corrected him, my voice slicing effortlessly through his pathetic, panicked justifications. And you did not pay it back. You defaulted. You took the seed money and you spent it on designer clothes, VIP nightclub tables, and luxury vacations to Aspen, while your so-called tech platform never advanced past a basic, unworkable presentation. You burned through the capital in less than 90 days. I pointed down to the thick manila folder resting in the snow at his feet. Because you missed your preliminary interest payment 3 days ago, the entire principal balance became immediately due, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. As the new legal holder of that debt, I executed my right to foreclose on the collateral. I now own 100% of the shares in the manufacturing company. You are entirely locked out of the operating accounts, the production facility, and the intellectual property. But I am not stopping at a simple corporate foreclosure. Cameron stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly, his eyes wide with a primal, suffocating fear. "What are you going to do?" he whispered, the winter wind catching his trembling words. "I am not just taking the company." I replied, my expression completely neutral, showing absolutely no mercy. Tomorrow morning, Marcus and his legal team are handing the complete unredacted file over to the fraud division of the original lending bank. We are providing them with your forged tax returns, the fake revenue ledgers, and the digital paper trail, proving you orchestrated the entire criminal scheme. They will refer the case directly to federal investigators. "You cannot do that!" Susan shrieked, crawling forward on her knees across the frozen porch. She reached out desperately, trying to grab the hem of my cashmere coat. "Chelsea, please. He is your brother. He will go to federal prison. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to prison." I stepped back smoothly, easily avoiding her grasping hands. "I am not sending him to prison, Susan. His own actions are sending him to prison. I am simply refusing to cover up a federal crime to protect a man who just rendered his own parents completely destitute and homeless." Cameron dropped heavily to his knees in the snow, the sharp movement cracking the ice beneath him. He grabbed his hair, pulling violently at the roots, letting out a long, ragged sound of pure despair. The illusion was entirely shattered. He was not a tech visionary. He was not a master of finance. He was a broke, fraudulent criminal waiting for a federal indictment. Throughout the entire execution, Brittany had stood silently in the shadows of the doorway. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the handle of her single piece of budget luggage so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She had listened to every single word. She had watched the financial and legal evisceration of her husband with wide, unblinking eyes. The grand, untouchable Midwestern dynasty she believed she had married into was a complete hollow mirage. There was no trust fund. There was no tech empire. There was no corporate safety net. There was only staggering debt, impending federal charges, and a weak, pathetic man sobbing in the snow. Brittany slowly walked forward, her boots crunching loudly against the frozen pavement. She stopped directly in front of Cameron, looking down at his trembling, pathetic form. Cameron lifted his head, his face wet with tears and melting snow, his split lip bleeding sluggishly down his chin. "Brittany," he choked out, reaching a shaking, desperate hand toward her ankle. "Brittany, please. We can fight this. I can call my networking contacts. I can fix this." Brittany stared down at him with an expression of absolute Arctic disgust. She did not yell, she did not cry. The sheer coldness of her demeanor was infinitely more devastating than any screaming match could ever be. "You have no contacts, Cameron." Brittany said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any affection or warmth. "You have nothing. You are nothing. You have spent our entire marriage lying to me, pretending you were building a massive empire while you were actually burning down your parents' house. I maxed out my personal emergency credit card to fly you home on a budget airline because you were too busy committing federal fraud to actually secure a legitimate functioning bank account." She reached for her left hand. With a swift, fluid motion, she pulled the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band off her finger. Cameron's eyes widened in sheer panic. "Brittany, no. Do not do this. You are my wife." "Not anymore," she stated with brutal finality. Brittany threw the heavy diamond rings directly at his chest. They hit his damp, freezing shirt with a sharp smack before bouncing off and burying themselves deep into a snowdrift. "I am not going down with a sinking ship," Brittany said, turning her back on him completely. "And I am certainly not visiting a broke fraud in a federal penitentiary." She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. Within seconds, she locked the device and slid it back into her coat. She picked up her suitcase and walked smoothly down the driveway, completely ignoring the chaotic sobbing mess of the Wilson family. She walked right past my SUV, stopping at the edge of the street to wait in the freezing blizzard. Less than 2 minutes later, the bright headlights of a ride-share vehicle cut through the blowing snow. The car pulled up to the curb, the driver looking confusedly at the dark, empty mansion and the figures crying on the porch. Brittany opened the trunk, hoisted her suitcase inside, and climbed into the warm back seat without a single backward glance. The car shifted into gear and drove away, the red taillights quickly swallowed by the fierce Chicago storm. Cameron remained on his knees, staring blankly at the empty space where his wife had just stood. He was completely alone, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing wind, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of his own arrogant creation. I turned to Marcus, feeling nothing but a profound cleansing sense of closure. The poison had finally been extracted. The truth was entirely exposed in the cold, unforgiving light. "Let us go, Marcus," I said, smoothly pulling open the heavy armored door of my vehicle. The interior was incredibly warm, the leather seats inviting and secure. We have a very busy morning ahead of us. I climbed into the SUV, pulling the door shut behind me. The thick glass instantly muted the frantic, pathetic sobbing of my former family. The engine roared to life, powerful and steady, and my driver smoothly navigated the vehicle down the snowy driveway. I did not look back at the empty, dark estate. I simply watched the snow falling gracefully onto the city streets, moving forward into a future I had built entirely with my own two hands. The heavy armored tires of the SUV crunched steadily against the rapidly accumulating snow, moving us further away from the grand illuminated facade of the estate and closer to the massive iron security gates. The heated custom leather seats and the quiet, meticulously engineered hum of the climate control created an absolute impenetrable sanctuary against the violent Chicago blizzard, raging just inches beyond the tinted glass. I leaned my head back against the headrest, closing my eyes, ready to leave the entire toxic, parasitic legacy of the Wilson family buried in the winter storm. But before my driver could turn the heavy steering wheel to merge onto the main suburban road, two frantic, desperate figures lunged out of the darkness of the tree line. They threw themselves directly into the path of our high-beam headlights, waving their arms in a spastic, uncontrolled panic. The driver instantly slammed on the brakes. The anti-lock braking system ground harshly against the ice as the heavy vehicle slid to a halt, mere feet away from the figures. Marcus immediately reached for his phone, his voice sharp and professionally alert. "I will call the local precinct to have them removed for obstructing traffic and trespassing on the driveway," Marcus said, his thumb hovering over the keypad. I raised a gloved hand, stopping him. "No," I said softly, my eyes fixed firmly on the illuminated scene playing out through the windshield. "Let me handle this final transaction." I pushed the heavy door open and stepped back out into the freezing, relentless wind. Richard and Susan were entirely unrecognizable. The meticulously crafted facade of untouchable suburban royalty had been utterly obliterated in the span of 30 minutes. They were covered in wet, freezing slush, their expensive tailored coats completely ruined by the driving snow. Their faces were pale and drawn with an absolute suffocating terror. When they saw me step into the bright glare of the headlights, their remaining pride completely evaporated. They collapsed. Richard, the man who had spent his entire life demanding obedience, crushing dissent, and projecting absolute authority, fell heavily to his knees in the freezing snowdrift. Susan crumbled right beside him, her hands clawing desperately at the icy pavement, her designer purse lying forgotten in a frozen puddle. They had finally entirely processed the catastrophic reality of their situation. The manufacturing business was gone, legally absorbed by my holding company. Their ancestral home was legally repossessed. Their bank accounts were frozen solid. Their golden boy Cameron was not a brilliant tech visionary, but a desperate, pathetic fraud who had literally stolen their entire future and was currently facing imminent federal prosecution. In one brutal, undeniable sweep of reality, they realized that the daughter they had spent a lifetime mocking, degrading, and casting aside was the incredibly loyal, highly successful billionaire they had violently thrown away. "Chelsea, please!" Richard begged, his voice a hoarse, ragged sob that tore through the freezing air and echoed off the brick walls of the empty house. He looked up at me, his face streaming with a mixture of tears and melting snow. "I am begging you. We were completely blind. We put all our faith in Cameron and he destroyed us. He lied to us about everything. We see it now. We see exactly what you have become. You are brilliant. You built an empire and we were too arrogant, too utterly stupid to recognize it. Please, Chelsea, you are our daughter. You are our own flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own family." Susan reached out her hands, shaking violently as the severe cold set deep into her bones. She was weeping so hard she could barely form the coherent words. "We are so incredibly sorry." Susan wailed, the sound pathetic and entirely broken. "Forgive us. Please forgive us for how we treated you. We were wrong. We were so wrong. We have absolutely nothing left. We have nowhere to go. It is below freezing out here, and we do not even have a car. Please, Chelsea, just let us stay in the house. The rooms are completely empty, but it has a roof. It has heat. Just give us a few days to stay in the empty house until we can figure out what to do. Do not leave us out here in the street to freeze." I stood completely still, the biting wind whipping my long, dark cashmere coat around my legs, staring down at the two people who had made my childhood and young adulthood an absolute emotional misery. I looked at Richard, shivering uncontrollably in the slush, and Susan begging for the charity of a bare, echoing room. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a single shred of familial obligation, or lingering affection. There was absolutely nothing there. The well had been poisoned and drained dry years ago by their own relentless cruelty. I reached a hand deep into the silk-lined pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cold leather of my wallet. I pulled it out, snapping it open in the bright glare of the SUV headlights. I withdrew two perfectly crisp, brand-new $100 bills. The green ink caught the harsh light as I held them up, letting the freezing wind tug aggressively at the edges of the paper. I looked down at my father, my expression as cold and unforgiving as the blizzard swirling violently around us. I remembered the sheer arrogance in his voice when he had dismissed my hard work, and the absolute disdain Susan had shown when she demanded I bow to Cameron's fraudulent superiority. "Here is the $200 you said an economy ticket would cost," I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity over the roar of the storm. I opened my fingers and released the bills. They fluttered rapidly through the icy air and landed directly in the wet, freezing slush, right in front of Richard's trembling knees. He stared at the money, his jaw trembling violently, the ultimate brutal irony of the gesture hitting him with the devastating force of a physical blow. "Take a Greyhound," I told them, delivering the final absolute truth of our relationship. "It is all I can afford for you." I turned my back on their hysterical, echoing sobs. I did not hesitate. I did not look over my shoulder to see if they picked up the wet cash. I walked smoothly back to the SUV, climbed inside the warm, secure cabin, and pulled the heavy door shut. The thick, soundproof glass completely severed the noise of their wailing, instantly returning my world to a state of absolute controlled peace. "Drive," I instructed softly. The vehicle smoothly accelerated, the heavy tires gaining instant traction on the snow. We rolled through the iron gates, leaving the ruined, weeping remnants of the Wilson family kneeling in the dark slush, permanently locked out of the future they had tried so desperately to steal. 2 hours later, the chaotic, freezing misery of the suburban estate was entirely replaced by the serene, ultra-luxurious atmosphere of the private aviation terminal at O'Hare International Airport. The severe winter storm had grounded nearly every commercial flight in the region, plunging the main passenger terminals into an absolute nightmare of delays and cancellations. But my logistics network ensured my airspace clearance remained perfectly intact. I walked across the pristine, heavily salted tarmac, the snow cleared perfectly from my path by the dedicated ground crew. Waiting for me was a sleek, long-range private jet, its massive engines humming with a deep, powerful readiness. I climbed the illuminated aluminum steps, shedding the heavy winter coat the exact second I crossed the threshold into the immaculate custom-designed cabin. Harrison, my chief operating officer, and one of my closest, most trusted confidants, was waiting for me in the main lounge area. The cabin was bathed in soft, warm light, a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. He was standing beside the polished mahogany bar, holding two crystal flutes filled with vintage, perfectly chilled champagne. He handed me a glass, his eyes bright with a mixture of immense professional respect and genuine warm friendship. "Is the corporate acquisition complete?" Harrison asked, a knowing, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "The manufacturing plant has been fully integrated into our portfolio," I replied, taking a slow, deeply appreciative sip of the champagne. "And the toxic elements have been completely eradicated from the ledger." Harrison raised his glass in a silent toast, fully understanding the immense personal weight of what had just transpired. He knew the history. He knew the scars. He knew exactly what it took for me to build Aerologics from a tiny, constantly overlooked startup into a global billion-dollar powerhouse, and he had supported me through every single brutal challenge. He was the family I had chosen when my biological family had proven themselves entirely unworthy of my loyalty. The highly trained cabin crew secured the heavy exterior door, sealing us inside the quiet, luxurious sanctuary of the aircraft. I sank into a wide, plush leather seat, feeling the subtle, powerful surge of acceleration as the jet taxied smoothly toward the cleared runway. The engines roared to life, pushing us firmly back into our seats as the aircraft lifted effortlessly off the icy ground, piercing directly through the heavy dark cloud cover and breaking out into the clear, brilliant starlight burning above the storm. We were heading toward Paris. I had rented a sprawling historic chateau just outside the city to celebrate the holidays with my true chosen family. The executive team, the brilliant engineers, the loyal friends who had believed in my vision when my biological family had simply laughed in my face. They were waiting for me. They respected me. They actually valued my presence not for what they could extract from me, but for exactly who I was. I turned my head and looked out the thick oval window. Far below, the sprawling grid-like lights of Chicago were rapidly shrinking, disappearing entirely into the dark, swirling mass of the winter blizzard. The grand suburban estate, the empty echoing rooms, the fraudulent golden boy, and the weeping parents kneeling in the slush were all gone, swallowed completely by the storm and relegated permanently to the past. I took another sip of champagne, feeling the crisp, bright bubbles against my tongue. My chest felt incredibly light. The crushing, lifelong weight of trying to earn an impossible conditional love was finally permanently gone. I looked out into the endless open sky stretching out toward Europe, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. I was completely free.